You're listening to Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live, coming to you from across the divided states of America. It is time now for another edition, another 3 great hours of the most disruptive show in American politics on the West Coast and in the politically independent corner. I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, and I'm going to get straight into it. Going into headlines, which we do, by the way, every morning thrice. That's 3 times, once at 7, one at 8, and once again at 9 a.m. Eastern. Those times, of course, are 4, 5, and 6 a.m. Pacific, if, like me, you're on the West Coast. Anywho, after this first batch of headlines, we go into Jamarl's monologue. Then after that, we take calls. You can give a call pretty much anytime you like, although the wisest time to call would be about 15 minutes from now. The number there is 202-521-1320. But without further ado, let's get into the headlines. Well, we're now 50 days out from the election, and Trump has just defended his decision to hold an indoor rally in Las Vegas. This has been a brewing news story over the last day and a half. The event that was in question here happened Sunday night. It was in defiance of Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak's orders to keep indoor meetings under 50 people. And the manufacturing plant that agreed to host the meeting, by the way, faced immediate threats, with Trump telling the audience, including, I'm assuming, the owners of the facility, that, quote, if the governor comes after you, which he shouldn't be doing, I'll be with you all the way, end quote. Again, I'll just point out, historically, the sort of upper levels of power siding with the lower levels of power against the middle levels of power, which is another way of looking at what's happening here in some sense. That's that's an old thing. Anyway, just interesting to note it in those terms. That's not, of course, all that's happening here. Many people could get sick and lose their lives if they catch it in these indoor facilities. Don't mean to diminish that in any way. Anyway, but getting too defensive about this stuff. Trump has also agreed to debate Joe Biden on Joe Rogan's show. That's the former TV host, podcaster Joe Rogan. This comes as, changing topics here, Hurricane Sally is hitting the Gulf states, the Gulf Coast, slowing from a Category 2 hurricane, which it was labeled yesterday, to a Category 1 hurricane as it slowly bears down on Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. A storm surge warning is currently in effect from the mouth of the Mississippi River to the Okaloosa-Walton County border in Florida. President Trump tweeted out that he and his team are monitoring the quote-unquote extremely dangerous hurricane, while advising state residents to, quote, be ready and listen to state and local leaders, end quote. Today in the White House, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel are going to be holding a ceremonial peace agreement, sort of substantial peace agreement, signing of a deal between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. News about this came out about a month ago, and then late last week, Bahrain joined in the deal. This came after both Bahrain and Saudi Arabia had opened up their airspace to flights to and from Israel. So a couple of sort of big moves here. In my opinion, this is kicking the proverbial can down the road on the issue specifically of Palestinian welfare, political representation, possible political independence. This move, however, has gotten Trump a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize. So this, just some notoriety, many people shaking their heads in wonder at that over this weekend. But regardless, definitely the case there. And again, Saudi Arabia, while it has not signed on to the deal, and that would be a big sort of thing, that would be one of the big dynamics here, one of the big events in terms of this cycle of events. While it has not signed on to the deal, it did again join Bahrain in allowing flights to and from Israel to use its airspace. Back over to the States, around 30% of Americans have pulled money out of their retirement accounts so far. This comes as evictions by big landlords are rising. According to data compiled by the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, an activist group partly funded by labor, evictions are also up, with institutional landlords, which are defined as those entities holding thousands of properties for rent, giving about 5.5 times more eviction notices than they had just a month ago. So the numbers that we're seeing were in the week starting August 3rd, this group had reported that these institutional landlords had given out 165 eviction notices. Again, this isn't like a whole nationwide thing. They're just doing a sort of sample from what I can tell. And then a month later, those eviction notices have jumped up to like over 900, around 900 total eviction filings. So again, 165 to 900 in the span of a month. Don't want to make too much out of relatively small numbers in the scheme of a nation, but still, if that's representative, that's a big deal. And we're surely going to see that going into the election. In somewhat related news, the DOJ, the Department of Justice, confirmed last night that its Inspector General's office has opened an internal investigation into the handling of Roger Stone. This follows the appearance of career prosecutor Aaron Zelinsky before Congress this June when he testified that prosecutors in the DOJ had received, quote, heavy pressure from the highest levels of the Department of Justice, end quote. Over in South Dakota's Attorney General said he thought he hit a deer the other night, but he actually hit a person. This incident happened Saturday evening. Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg reported the incident just a few minutes after it took place from the side of his vehicle at about 10:30 p.m. Saturday night. As of Sunday morning, however, it was revealed that the victim was a man who was dead. Poor guy. We'll see what happens from this. Couple last quick headlines here. A cave bear. Scientists in Siberia just confirmed a first-of-its-kind discovery of an extinct species of cave bear, a specimen which in this case had its soft cell tissues intact. Reindeer herders recently stumbled upon the remains of a cave bear on the Liakovsky Islands in the Arctic, which were extraordinarily well preserved. So well preserved, in fact, that the soft tissues of the animal are intact, including essentially the entirety of its head. Again, you can see an extinct cave bear's head preserved in its entirety for basically the first time here. Not basically, for the first time. The remains of the animal have not yet been timed using radiocarbon dating, so we don't know how exactly how old the specimen is, although it is estimated that they're between 22,000 and 39,500 years old. So there's about a 17,500 year span there of age. I feel like that's sometimes too old, Bear. Venus. Scientists from MIT, Harvard, and Georgetown University say that they found phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus, a chemical which they can only explain right now by the presence of life. Jamarl, I hope you're listening. Phosphine is the product of one phosphorus and three hydrogen atoms in a pyramidic molecular structure. In the more pressurized atmospheres of larger planets, such as Jupiter or Saturn, phosphine can form through atmospheric pressure by the atoms simply being joined together. But on Venus, the three scientists have said that the presence of phosphine in this case is, quote, unexplained after exhaustive study of steady-state chemistry and photochemical pathways with no currently known abiotic production routes in Venus's atmosphere, clouds, surface, and subsurface, or from lightning, volcanic, or meteoritic delivery, end quote. It's a lot of words, I know. They're basically saying they can't think of another way to create this on Venus other than life. They say that the phosphine, quote, could originate from unknown photochemistry or geochemistry, or by analogy with biological production of phosphine on Earth from the presence of life, end quote. Again, they're basically saying there, it could be happening by some way we don't know about, through the interactions of light, the interactions of, atoms on the surface of this planet. But we don't know how that would happen right now. The only way that we would know this would happen in this case would be by life. That study was soon picked up by the New York Times and other outlets. It has since stirred up a heated debate, and you can find it and read it for yourself if you want to. Just do a quick search for, quote, phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus, end quote. And with that, that's my last and possibly one of the more significant headlines I'll ever give if it bears out. Low likelihood of that, but hey, we'll see. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. Those are the headlines. Oops. All right. Jamarl, what's on your mind today? What do you want to talk about in your monologue, man?
So it's funny. I've been bouncing back and forth between two stories, and I think I'm going to end up on this one. ICE whistleblower complaints alleges uterus collector doctor performed mass hysterectomies. This was a story that broke yesterday that basically boiled down to, in one of the ICE facilities, a doctor will come in and will engage with women who don't speak English and will basically get signatures to have their hysterectomies. Now, whether they needed them or not, it was unknown. And many of the women that they went to and asked about this, the women had no way of explaining why this was taking place. Now, I'm going to read just the Daily Beast because they have a very short explanation of this. And I kind of want to make a point to you that this is infinitely foreseeable given all sorts of incentives. And some of this, people may not necessarily understand about doctors. People may not understand about nurses, but I want to give a little bit of context based on nearly 30 years of experience with both. There's no situation that you should ever leave your loved one in the hands of a hospital without somebody being there that will be an advocate for that person. Full stop. I don't say this because I have to say that doctors are horrible people or nurses are horrible people. It's an issue of authority, and it's an issue of the inability of the person to advocate for themselves, requiring somebody else to advocate for them. That nurse is not there to advocate for the patient. That doctor is there to do a particular job, and that nurse is going to follow the orders that are given by that doctor, whether or not it is in the best patient's interest or whether or not the patient even understands entirely what's going on. This is something that people think that, well, they're in good hands. They may be in good hands in the specific medical sense, but they also may not necessarily be in good hands in the sense of a doctor who thinks he knows more than what he actually knows, and a nurse who's going to follow the orders of that doctor who believes that he knows more than he actually knows. This case is foreseeable because, A, you have not only people with no power in the medical space, meaning you have the least of the least immigrants who are in basically a cage, who are basically at the whim of a facility, and not just a facility, a doctor at that point, who has all agency in the world to basically do whatever he wants to get the bills and to get the financial cash that he gets. Whether it's racial, in the sense of I want to eliminate these people from being able to give birth later on, whether it's financial, I want to come up with a case that I can come up with where I can get paid for and not too many people paid all that much attention to, is almost less important than the fact that it is capable of happening. And these are happening apparently at ICE institutions. You have a doctor who basically has leeway. You have a group of people who the public basically doesn't all that much care about. And you have a perfect combination where that guy can make a bit of cash off of these people, misery, who can't even speak the language, to explain to you what travesty is taking place. Yes, I'm making the basic point that whatever you think of doctors, doctors are human beings, and I've been in case of many of them who would like to make a profit more so than whatever necessarily is healthy or necessary in a medical sense. This story is abominable. It's even more appalling that it's taking place at our facilities with the backing of the U.S. government of sorts. But the fact that it can happen at all, especially since I am making the point that it is foreseeable to happen, makes it that much worse. Several immigration advocacy groups filed a complaint on behalf of whistleblower nurse to the Office of Inspector General on Monday, alleging jarring medical neglect and a lack of COVID-19 safety precautions at Irwin County Detention Facility in Georgia. Among several charges of negligence, the complaint describes reports of high rates of hysterectomies performed on Spanish-speaking immigrant women. The whistleblower, Dawn Wooten, said she believed the women who did not speak English well did not fully understand why the procedure had performed on them. Notice something else. It's a whistleblower, but it's a person who you can go to. It's not anonymous. It's not like this anonymous person said this about X or Y. No, you can go to the individual and the individual can explain what they're talking about and back up their claims. The Intercept, Wooten told the Intercept of the situation at Irwin resembled a silent pandemic, referring to the other charges of workplace safety violations detailed in Monday's complaint. Upon meeting several of the women in detention who had received the hysterectomies, one unnamed detainee in the complaint likened the experience to an experimental concentration camp. Wooten also questioned the doctor who works outside the facility. Everybody he sees has a hysterectomy. Just about everybody, Wooten said. Everybody's uterus cannot be that bad, she added after referring to him as, quote-unquote, the uterus collector. What stops the doctor from doing that? Nothing. Can they explain the situation saying we don't want this? And can they even complain to guards who don't necessarily care and they're just there to do a job? No, they can't. I'm making the point that this is horrendous. And yes, as horrendous as this is, foreseeable. If you have a government organization that collects people that your society basically doesn't care about and throws those people away, then yes, in the dark corners of those cells, bad things, horrible things happen. This is potentially just one of them. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host Shane Stranahan. We're coming to you out of the station in DC, 105.5 FM, if you guys are listening by radio. Also, we're in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. We are taking calls. You can reach us at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. It is your engagement that makes the show what it is, so definitely don't feel shy to do so. One thing I want to add on to what I just said. I don't come to this conclusion of, look, you shouldn't necessarily leave people to their own devices in the hospitals. Honestly, I think it makes all the rational sense in the world. That person is ill. That person is going through something, regardless of the significance and the severity of that illness. The nurses and the doctors there, yes, they may believe they were doing the right thing, but just because people believe they're doing the right thing doesn't necessarily mean that they are. And it requires an advocate for that person who is in diminished capacity to take care of themselves and advocate for themselves, in which case you have another person there who is potentially belligerent, but again, there for the interests of the patient. The COVID has made this more complicated because it has left people to the whims of various doctors and medical institutions. And that is dramatically unfortunate, especially for people who can't necessarily advocate for themselves. I've been in a situation, Dr. Mendez, Richmond, Virginia, Henrico Hospital. He used to be a surgeon. I don't know what he's doing now. Where after surgery, I was already a difficult medical case at that point because of all sorts of other weirdness. After the surgery, I make the point to him that I'm in pain. I have stomach pain. He does an x-ray, can't find anything. So, okay, I don't see anything. I keep making the point to him, making a point to the nurses. This goes on in perpetuity. The person who's there with me is not necessarily an advocate for my behalf, so that doesn't necessarily help. And over the course of a week, where continuously, hour by hour by hour, this is hurting, I'm in pain, does the exact same procedure day after day, meaning just an x-ray to clear his name, just so he can say, well, I did an x-ray, while not attending to the fact that the person who just told you he's in pain. Now, either he believes I'm lying to him, or either he believes I am, for whatever reason, seeking pain medication, something that there was no record of doing. He let it ride. A few months later, I go back to him, and it seems that the pain that I was experiencing in the hospital actually did have a medical case that if you would have looked a little further, you probably would have found. And not just that, goes back to a surgeon that took place by an alcoholic doctor, or a doctor we believe strongly was an alcoholic, that was pushed to do an emergency stomach bowel resection at the time. And that didn't necessarily go well because, after all, he was a drunk. Mendez eventually contacts this drunk and says, hey, what's with the surgery that you performed where you royally screwed up? In which case he said, I couldn't get to the particular area. Now, the catch here is not whether or not the drunk could get to that area. The issue here is that Mendez is a dramatically great surgeon, has all the capacity in the world to do what that doctor couldn't necessarily do, but didn't care enough to ensure that the person who said they were in pain was actually in pain for a real legitimate reason. To which I asked him, hey, so this wasn't fake, was it? This was actually real pain that I was experiencing at the time when I was under your care, where you just let it ride. To which he didn't have much to say. Nor will Mendez ever come out and say anything about the previous doctor because, just like police, they work in tandem with one another. The point I'm making here is you can't trust your people, family members, loved ones, to medical institutions regardless of what you believe is in their best interest. Yes, they may be doing a great job, or they may not be doing a great job. The nurse is there only to follow the instincts of the doctor, and any other doctor that's under that doctor is going to follow the instincts of that particular doctor too, leaving your person that you care about alone in a diminished capacity. Don't do it. What this doctor did here was foreseeable because that doctor's a person. And regardless of the biases that you have in your head that this guy is working in the interests of the best, he may or may not be. I've come across doctors who would do procedures that weren't necessarily necessary in order to get a paycheck. You can go to ERs today and you have doctors creeping the hallways looking to give a blood pressure or looking to give some procedure so they can get paid by a person who don't even know why they're there. Protect your people. And unfortunately, you have an immigrant community that don't have those protections. Shane, what did you think about the story? I mean, I would imagine you would find the story to be horrendous. But is it really that not foreseeable? Let's say it that way. Let me ask in that way.
It's it felt close to a double negative. It is. I feel that it's foreseeable. I feel that it is foreseeable, especially somewhere. No, that's the thing. I'll put three, just give you three different institutions that guard and intervene in these huge spheres of human activity or whatever. You have police, the education, and the medical system. And there are plenty of others, massive institutions, but these are ones that people normally come to during like pivotal moments in their life. So obviously with education, that's pretty massive. You're young, you're held by this higher authority that can do pretty much whatever it wants with you, not legally, but practically while you're in its custody. So that's thing one. And then, that last part, that's obviously also true with the police and with the medical establishment too, with the healthcare industry and insurance, frankly. This as one continuous industry. With all three of these industries, it is your life and limb that's in question here. Literally, you're in the physical custody of these ones. And it doesn't seem like any shock to me that all three of these industries, and they are all industries in the United States, have been beleaguered, thankfully, by complaint after complaint after complaint after complaint. It's not a surprise. That would happen because the system that would hopefully intervene in and fix some of the problems that these lower lying systems have, the political system, is broken, and it has been for decades, for much longer than I've been alive, at least in the United States. Again, I don't mean to bring it too simply to that high level, but like, if I abstract out of your story for a second, I just see these institutions in American society failing and getting worse over time without a clear purpose or vision of exactly what their role in life and the economy and stuff should be. And as they've gotten worse over time, again, they haven't been repaired. It's just this broken cycle. I think, as we're seeing with these protests, and I'm going to come back to you in a second, these protests are spurred in response to the police system. It is when people run into problems with the institutions that are supposed to help them and that don't help them that you see the kinds of civil unrest that we see in the streets. And it's ultimately those low-level interactions that I think are going to be the kind of gradual undoing, the chaos that unsettles our society from the bottom up. Because frankly, if you go into a situation where you're expecting the authority to help you, whether you're calling the cops for them to save your life, or whether you're going into a hospital for a doctor or a surgeon to save your life and keep you from too much misery, if they don't do that, and you're the recipient, if your family member, your son or your sister or your spouse is bearing the pain of that interaction, that altercation, that creates wounds that you do not forget, that you do not forgive. And I think for a lot of people, that's why they're protesting. I don't mean to turn it too trivially to that. And again, I criticize the protests as protests. I wish that there were more institution building and stuff. I'm critical. But just taking a sort of brass tacks view of this stuff, it's inevitable that stuff's going to happen if you have these massive institutional failures, which we do. So that's my response to Jamarl.
No, I agree.
This is clearly a personal story for you too, and I didn't mean to step out of it too much with abstraction there. That's just kind of where my mind went,
Well, it's both, right? I mean, because if you're talking about the medical stuff, I mean, look, whatever happens to any particular individual is probably happening to other people also. So it's never really just specifically individual. It's oftentimes one of those things that just kind of go out. There is implicit bias in some cases, where a person may be of one race dealing with somebody of another race where they don't entirely identify with them. And because they don't have that identification, they don't necessarily see them in a similar kind, meaning they don't trust. The trust is not there. You have gender bias at times where in cases where the insurance companies was allowing men doctors to do hysterectomies, they would do them more because they didn't necessarily have the, let's say, the emotional faculty to recognize, hey, that person may want to have kids later, and maybe you need to put that as a higher priority. Like, these things happen in the way that we engage one another, and I don't even necessarily know how you pass a law to deal with something like that. That seems like more of a personal issue or interpersonal thing where you have to kind of just trust the person who you're dealing with. And that's not an absolute. I've been in cases where I've heard somebody say, I'm in pain, doc. And they say, where? Everywhere. And it's like, all right, clearly I'm not going to give this guy. I'm delighted for something where the guy can't even articulate the pain thing. So it's not an absolute, and so I don't take it that way. I would say, though, that we have, I think in our medical system, we sometimes ignore the fact that that's a person. And while it is the doctor's priority to try to deal with the issue that he's availed with, and may not necessarily want to deal with other stuff, the person should be the priority in that, and not just specifically medical, if that makes sense. Like, the person goes beyond the medical part. And oftentimes the conflict, at least in my experience, in dealing with doctors, comes with the discrepancy between the two things. Meaning my priority versus his priority. And because my priority is the entirety of the person, it is going to win out, despite the fact that they may disagree with such. Now, our medical system is strange. I mean, A, it's for profit, which also adds a certain problematic thing to it in and of itself. What happens when that person can't pay for the drug that you've just prescribed? They're compliant, they just can't afford it. Like, we have that stuff take place all the time. And it's just kind of part and parcel to our medical system. Now, there are a few problems. I agree with you, Shane. I think there's decay more so in some systems more than others. But yeah, I agree. I think I agree with what you just said. We do have a call.
I think, and we do, yeah. And just part of what happens here is it's a bureaucracy, you know. Right. So this is literally a problem as old as civilization, where the needs of any given human being run up against the system that the society, the people in general have built to solve whatever problem through oppression or charity, whatever. Anyway, the point is the problem of you running up against that's as old as civilization itself. You're right. There are probably some uniquely American aspects of that. In fact, there definitely are. We could get into that later, but you're right. We've got a call. Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on?
Good morning, gentlemen. I have 5 quick comments, not going to be long before I get into them. Jamarl, I'm glad you're back.
Thanks, man.
So, hashtag Joe must show. Hashtag Joe Rogan debate. The AstraZeneca COVID-19 test subject stricken with multiple sclerosis and respiratory disorders, but the trial will continue on with the vaccine. The article, I'll put the article on HRT today for Julian Assange, dealing with Joe Biden. They said in 2010 called him a cyber terrorist. The people of California need to stop this, dealing with the new California bill with lower penalty for adults who have sexual relations with minors. You're talking about from 14 to 17 years old. They're going to lower the penalty. Gavin Newsom is going to try to pass that bill. Want that bill to pass. And my last comment is dealing with we had a summit yesterday dealing with sickle cell for African Americans and Latinos at the White House. Melania Trump was there, thank God, to sit down and talk to these people. I didn't know sickle cell was that serious, but when they was describing how the inner body was hurt and how people were dying from it and all that, and they need these special medications, and the doctors didn't want to give them the medication. And yeah, one particular family, they lost their house 3 times because of medical bills. And people lost jobs, and they got them, they can't work, so they got to go on Social Security, and they got this, they get labeled drug addicts too because they need pain medicine. And so something needs to be done, man, in this country. We need a better insurance company. I mean, we need single payer, we need Medicaid, we need something. Because people shouldn't suffer because they don't have money in the bank account. So, Tarif, thank you for the call. I want to respond to a couple of things real quick. For one thing, you brought up AstraZeneca. You were talking about the vaccine trial. AstraZeneca, big UK-based, as far as I can tell, UK-based pharmaceutical company, drug research company. Anyway, they're one of the big companies in the sort of Western vaccine space doing vaccine development. You mentioned how apparently one of the recipients of that vaccine, this was widely reported, didn't know exactly what had happened,
apparently they contracted symptoms of like multiple sclerosis. They're having serious problems. And again, like you said, this comes as AstraZeneca restarted those trials. They're planning on restarting those trials, at least, last I heard. Another side of this that I came out, I didn't include this in headlines this morning, but I'll throw it in now because you brought them up. AstraZeneca, there's also a report that came out that's criticizing AstraZeneca for, despite receiving like over $1 billion in vaccine aid for them to do their vaccine development, apparently AstraZeneca during the coronavirus crisis raised their drug prices more than most other drug companies. So again, I'll set the scene up for you. They get a lot of money to develop the vaccine, and yet they raise their drug prices.
Why wouldn't they?
Just very simply.
Why wouldn't they?
Yeah, which leaves many people scratching their heads, wondering what's going on here. Is this ethically right, et cetera?
Wait. We have to go to the next break. Wait, Shane. We have to go to the next break.
Exactly.
But I would say, why would they
let's do it.
not do that? That's all. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak: The Deadliest Epidemics in Human History, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're going to be going into an interview with Laith Marouf. Laith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant. Laith, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me again. It's always great to be on your show.
Yeah, thank you again for joining us. The last couple of times we've had you on, I believe, in a row, we've been discussing both times the Beirut explosion, the aftermath there, and what was actually going on. We're going to get back into that in a second. I think maybe it makes sense. We'll see how it goes. To start with the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel deal taking place early today, within the next couple of hours probably, over in D.C. at the White House. One notable thing, I'll set this up very briefly. So about a month ago, it was announced that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel had come to a quote-unquote historic peace deal, basically opening up diplomatic relations for the first time in decades, essentially for the first time ever, since the creation of the State of Israel, as far as I can tell. Not too long ago, about 3 weeks later, it was announced that Bahrain would be joining in on that deal. It had been announced just before that also that Bahrain and Saudi Arabia had opened up their airspace. So this set of moves is taking place. A lot of people, sort of on our side, I'll be that blunt, a lot of people who look at Israel kind of critically and wonder about how Palestinians are being represented, what the situation there is like, the whole humanitarian crisis. They're wondering, where's the Palestinian representation? What's going on? So I suppose I'll start there and we can get into the facts. Why are Palestinians not in D.C. right now signing some kind of deal of their own, Laith?
Because Palestinians don't want to sell their land to the Zionists. They're resisting colonization and imperialism, and even the weakest leadership in Palestine doesn't want to be remembered in history as the traitors of their own people. So, given the fact that you see right now, Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, taking a position that is radical, pulling out of the Oslo Agreement and agreeing to launch popular resistance against apartheid Israel. That shows you that the Palestinians are united against any deal with apartheid Israel that will, maintain the superiority of the colonists over the indigenous people.
Let me ask you this. When I saw this deal, my thought went to, well, let me start here. This is a weird analogy, but I think it fits. Obama's blackness didn't stop him from giving 95% of the income gains to the top 1%. Now, the issue wasn't necessarily an issue of race. The issue was class, meaning how money basically spends. And people without don't necessarily get a vote in the process. Is this what we're dealing with? Meaning the ruling families, regardless of what they say they believe in, what they care about, at the end of the day, this boils down to the issue of the distinction between them, their wealth, as opposed to the other people who are on the ground without necessarily that wealth, that may actually be in alignment with the Palestinian cause. Meaning the discrepancy is an issue of class, not necessarily an issue of political allegiance with Palestinians.
Partially, I would say you're right. The other part is that you have to remember that even from a communist perspective, national liberation movements, even if they're led by upper or middle class populations, are a million times better than defeatist forces. So on the one hand, yes, class is an issue if you consider all Arab people are as one people, and that the upper class is those in power in the Gulf countries, because their wealth is different than the rest of us. But on the other hand is that we have to remember that all these states, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Qatar, are all manufactured states that didn't exist ever and had very small populations when they were granted independence by the British. The British, seeing the Arab nationalist and unification and socialism forces that were in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, steamrolling the French and British out of the Arab world, rushed and manufactured these states that had at the time less than 100,000 population in each one of those, Qatar, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates. They brought in imported ruling families, and the ruling families in Bahrain, Qatar, and the United Emirates are not actually native to those lands. They are part and parcel of the Saud family, the clan of the Sauds, and they, branches of that clan were given control of the indigenous populations there. And this is why we see the Bahraini people out in demonstrations for the last couple of days. The majority of Bahrainis out in social media condemning the treasonous moves by their occupying elites.
If and I know you're right, if Saudi Arabia is the crucial partner, because like you're saying, other states in that region are effectively part of the Saudi royal family, Saudi Arabia as a monarchy, the royal family is the sort of sine qua non for political decision-making there. Looking at the Saudis, what do you see them doing? They're not a part of this deal. They're not coming to Washington. When do you think they would? What do you think the factors that are affect that? Broadly, what do you think is going to happen there, Laith?
Well, obviously, those very small states don't have any weight in the Arabic world, and they wouldn't have made this deal with apartheid Israel without the approval of Saudi Arabia and the Saud family. And what I expect is that Saudi Arabia is holding off until the elections in the United States, and if Trump wins the elections, which looks very, very likely, in my opinion, then they will go ahead and take that move, because the intention of what is happening right now is not really peace between these states, because they were always had peace behind the closed doors, and they were always plotting together with apartheid Israel against any progressive, socialist, or unification movements in the Arabic world. What they're doing right now is preparing the grounds for a war with Iran, and where actually these little Gulf principalities will become the battleground after the election of Trump, re-election.
Wow. Let me ask you this. If those governments, those small governments, the Qatars, the Saudi, even let's say put in Saudi Arabia, were left to their own devices, how would the populations respond? Meaning, do you think that they are able to maintain their power base without outside intervention from, let's say, the U.S., either from the standpoint of weapons or support, or goons with thick necks backing the governments up? Or do you think it's one of those things where the power grip is significant, that the populations would basically relent and allow the government to function as a totalitarian states in the way that they have? If that question makes sense. I'm just curious about our intervention and how much pressure it takes in order to keep those governments the way they are and to keep the people into the population in the way that they're kept.
No, I mean, these states would not exist within like hours if the United States and before it England did not prop up these governments. They would disappear within hours. And I want to make it clear that the populations in the Arab Peninsula are hostage for the last 100 years under the totalitarian regime of the Wahhabi extremists. Just to give you an example, we all have seen the death fields and the rape factories in North Syria and Iraq that ISIS did in between 2013 and until their defeat. But when the United Kingdom wanted the Saud family to take over the Hijaz, which is the region where Mecca and Medina is, in 1930, they gave them weapons, and these Wahhabi death squads, just like ISIS, marched from Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, and raped and pillaged every village, every town, all the way to Mecca. And inside Mecca itself, it was rivers of blood in 1930. They destroyed all the mausoleums of the over the graves of the wives of Muhammad, the disciples of Muhammad. They destroyed the whole architectural design of the city, and they, raped people to become Wahhabis. So the people in Saudi Arabia themselves, inside, are hostages. And the minute there is no imperial force protecting the Wahhabi Saudi alliance, it will all fall apart.
Laith, one last question before we go into a break, and we're probably going to move on after this. We'll see, but probably start talking about Beirut, more recent fires there. But one last question here. About 5 months ago, the price of crude over in the States, but obviously it affects global oil markets. The price of crude oil dropped to negative values. That was the first for me. This comes as right now, obviously, with a lot of stuff going on. Germany negotiating Nord Stream 2, Navalny's poisoning weighs in on that, of course. This also comes as Turkey and Cyprus are fighting over oil. And many other nations in the Eastern Mediterranean are drilling for oil. So oil, I'll put it like this. The sort of political chessboard of oil and of petrochemicals and natural gas has shifted significantly in recent years. Do you think that's affecting this peace deal? If so, how?
Well, sometimes things are opposite of what are publicized. So when we talk about this crash of prices of oil, it may have looked like it was harmful to the Gulf countries. But in reality, the aim was to destroy the economies of Russia, Iran, and Venezuela.
Right.
And it was done intentionally. Okay. So these countries just follow orders of what is given to them as an order by the imperialists, and they don't care about their own economies because that's, what this is not what they're there for. So, of course, it was a fabricated crisis, which doesn't make sense. But at the same time, if you look, the United States basically filled its reserve storage houses within days, enough oil to fight a world war without having to worry about its oil supply if it does so. Now we're seeing the prices come back to something that is more reasonable. But if we actually want to price oil as it should be, and everything around us right now, when we look around us, is covered in some petrochemical material. It's not only what runs the engines and so on. Everything else is, the paints that we have in our houses, the plastics, everything. So oil is the most important asset in the world, and for some reason, is cheaper than water still today.
Very, very interesting. Absolutely true. Just to briefly sum up, and you can come back and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but it sounds like you're saying it was a forced event. The price shock that I was talking about earlier this year was a forced event. You don't see it as materially impacting the stuff. I'll let you come back and respond on the other side as we get into Beirut. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We're just speaking with Laith Marouf, award-winning multimedia producer and media policy and law consultant. We'll be back with him in a minute, talking about the Beirut bombing and subsequent fires. Again, we'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Laith Marouf. Laith, thank you again for joining us. We're speaking with Laith in the last segment about Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel, specifically as the UAE and Bahrain come to DC, come to the U.S., sign a peace deal with Israel. We talked about that. I want to move on into talking about Beirut. Laith, while back, as we brought you on to talk about this historic, devastating bomb, suspected bomb, I should say. Technically, I can't actually say without any hesitation that it was a bomb, simply because bombs don't need to be set by people. As we were going out, I called it a historic bombing. You suspect, as you said before on the show, and we have voiced some suspicions, that it could be Israel or it could be another country that did this. President Donald Trump very quickly came out after the original event took place and said that he thought that it was intentional. That was kind of hushed up on a high level, or at least a little bit criticized and then kind of glossed over. More recent events have been happening, however, including as recently as I believe earlier today, when I saw Zaha Hadid, the late architect, the building he had designed went up in smoke. Literally was on fire today. This is I think the third time this has happened in the past month. What's been going on in Beirut, Lebanon, Laith?
Yeah, so this architectural treasure that was designed by Zaha Hadid, a very famous Iraqi architect, who is not fully constructed. It was still under construction. Somehow went up in flames this morning. This is the third major fire within a week, including the big fire in the port of Beirut last Thursday. So, and we keep on hearing that both the explosion in the port, which is now 5 weeks ago, and these three major fires that happened within a week are all because of welding accidents. Okay, and so in order for somebody to believe that, you know, all these major fires have happened in the last month in Beirut because of welding accidents, while there hasn't been any fires in Lebanon in at least a decade, fires of this magnitude. In order to believe that, you also have to basically believe that Lebanese people are subhuman, that you know, you have to actually believe in the white supremacist position that you know, we are incompetent in this land. It's the same thing that, you know, in order to believe that Russia, every time it's winning economic battles, decides that it's going to poison a dissident. It's the same thing that, you know, somebody would believe that Syria, every time it's winning the battle in the battlefield, decides to use chemical weapons on its enemies. All of this is only based on the premise of that the enemies of the West are subhuman, and therefore I think today they overdid it. The agents of the imperialists overdid it with this stupid fire at the Zaha Hadid building, because now it's clear that we're within, you know, there is a hybrid war in full force in Lebanon.
So, Laith, you believe that these fires weren't coincidental, that each of these were set? I mean, I have to be honest, after a major explosion takes place, where there are protests, where there are pushbacks against the government and those type of things, where you have a youthful generation who's trying to get change. And, you know, tell me if I'm wrong, that chaos and accidents can happen. Like, so I don't necessarily think that's a subhuman thing. I think that's just a perfectly rational response to chaos. I mean, that's like saying all of the fires that were taking place in Portland were because people were subhuman. No, I think those people were pushing back against a system they didn't particularly like. And in doing so, fire was one of the easiest things to set. I'm not saying that the exact same thing is taking place in Lebanon, so don't misunderstand me. But certainly there's a gap or a difference between 3 fires set in a period of time during political chaos versus the people are subhuman for setting the fires.
No, I what I meant is that to believe that all these things happened in the last month in Lebanon, all these major fires, including the biggest non-nuclear explosion in human history,
right,
were all because our laborers are stupid. Some welding accidents keep on happening. That basically is a belief that Lebanese people are less than, are not capable even to weld a door. And that's something I kind of believe. I mean, this is different than, let's say, what is happening in Oregon and the fires in California. There's no comparison here.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I was just trying to get it.
Yeah, one quick thing here. Yeah, I'd heard that. It was interesting. Anyway, one quick thing here is just the state of Lebanon is also going through an unprecedented political and economic crisis, from what I can tell, with basically the entire government in disarray. Actually, I want to ask you about that, so we can get to that in a second. But just briefly, I don't know what the heck happened here. For me, I'm an ocean, several oceans away, arguably at least an ocean and a sea away, thousands of miles and a world of expertise away, certainly, from giving any judgment here. It's all speculation, certainly from our end, and from a lot of ends, a lot of it's unknown. One sort of hedging note, voice on the other side, is just, again, they're going through an unprecedented political and economic crisis. That means certain things are going to be overlooked. Some things that should be taken care of probably aren't anymore. It wouldn't necessarily be, I wouldn't see it as the workers' fault if this stuff went wrong. I do see what you're saying, Laith, there, which is you're saying in a weird way, if other countries are going to blame Lebanese workers for causing these problems when there are wide suspicions that it's an outside influence, that it's an outside party or country or intelligence agency that's responsible for this stuff. In that same sense, it's like blaming Assad for gassing his troops, despite there being absolutely no sense in his gassing his troops. I guess my point is, I don't know what happened here, frankly. It's all uncertain. But with the government, with the state of the government in Lebanon, what's been going on there? What is the government that could come to follow it? What is the process like? Obviously, major protests ongoing. How have those protests been going? There's so much to talk about here, sadly. And we only have a few minutes left, Laith. But if you can give us an update on the political situation there, that'd be great.
So the French president got what he wanted. He got a prime minister in waiting who's trying to form a government. This prime minister, his wife is French citizen, not of Lebanese origin, and her father is one of the major voices and funders and active members within the Macron political party in France. So it's a clear colonial bargaining that is happening. He has tried to form a cabinet, and what he has been doing is he's trying to push out Hezbollah and the resistance parties here from any ministerial positions, which led to Hezbollah and the political party of the president, the Patriotic Movement, to say they're not going to join this government, which now we're in a total chaos situation, because if this incoming prime minister cannot create a government, so we're in chaos. And at the same time, yesterday, the Kataib, which is one of the Christian supremacist parties here in Lebanon that were responsible for the Sabra and Shatila massacre in the 1980s, actually came out with their militia yesterday in the streets of Beirut and surrounded the headquarters of the Patriotic Movement, the party of the president, and a gunfight ensued. So we're at a very edgy situation where the imperialists are threatening the Christian forces within Lebanon that are sovereigntist with these militias, and at the same time, the pressure is coming for them to accept the new cabinet that the West wants to install. So I don't know where we're going to go, but it's just getting more dangerous by the day.
That's astonishing. I mean, honestly, it really is. And this level of destabilization basically was inspired because of the explosion.
2 minutes.
Let me ask you this. From the standpoint of the Constitution, I think the last time you were here, we were having a conversation about the way that the Constitution is set up, where it creates this kind of sectarian system, almost forced. Has there been any moves or play to try to undermine that? I mean, I guess if I'm understanding you correctly, this sounds like the origins of somewhat of a beginning of a budding war of sorts. So I would imagine the Constitution maybe takes secondary precedent in this moment. Or am I understanding that correctly? Am I misrepresenting what you're saying? And by the way, we have but a minute.
Yeah, no, you're not. Yeah, you're not misrepresenting. The thing is that if there was a secular democratic election in Lebanon, Hezbollah would win a resounding majority with its allies. So nothing will change for those who are working with the empire, which means that they don't really want that. What they're interested in is collapsing the government and making Lebanon into a battlefield, so they can somehow bring in, the imperialist forces or Israel directly on the ground in Lebanon, and that is not going to happen easily.
And France, one last quick question here while we have you, only about 20 seconds left. France, obviously formerly Lebanon, a colony under France. France recently saying they will step
30.
And Pompeo this morning cautioning France against stepping in, saying that they should try to get Iranian support for Hezbollah.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And standing well away from any corners, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
You are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to some headlines. In the news. Now, 50 days out from the election, Trump is defending his decision to hold an indoor rally in Las Vegas Sunday night in defiance of Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak's order to keep indoor meetings under 50 people. The manufacturing plant that agreed to host the meeting faced immediate threats of fines from the city of Henderson, with Trump telling the audience that if the governor comes after you, which he shouldn't be doing, I'll be with you all the way. Wow. Hurricane Sally has slowed from a Category 2 hurricane, which was labeled yesterday, to a Category 1 hurricane as it slowly bears down on Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. A storm surge warning is in effect from the mouth of the Mississippi River to the Ocala, Walton County border in Florida. President Trump tweeted out that he and his team are monitoring the extremely dangerous while advising state residents to, quote-unquote, be ready and listen to state and local leaders. Listen to your local leaders, except for when I am doing a rally in Nevada. The White House is today hosting a ceremonial peace agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, normalizing relations with the two key Gulf states in the region while kicking the proverbial can down the road on the issue of Palestinian welfare, political representation, and possible political independence. In a move that has gotten Trump a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, Bahrain and the UAE joined Egypt and Jordan in diplomatically recognizing the existence of the State of Israel. Saudi Arabia, while it has not signed onto the deal, joined Bahrain in allowing flights to and from Israel to use its airspace earlier this September. Around 30% of Americans have pulled money out of their retirement accounts so far, and this comes as evictions by big landlords are rising. According to data compiled by Private Equity Stakeholder Project, an activist group partially funded by labor, evictions are also up with institutional landlords, which are defined as those entities holding thousands of properties for rent, giving about 5.5 times more eviction notices than they had just a month ago. The Department of Justice confirmed last night that its Inspector General office has opened an internal investigation into the handling of Roger Stone. This follows an appearance of career prosecutor Aaron Zelinsky before Congress this June, which he testified that prosecutors in the Department of Justice have received, quote-unquote, heavy pressure from the highest levels of the Department of Justice. South Dakota's Attorney General said he thought that he had hit a deer the other night, but he actually hit a human being, a person. This incident happened Sunday evening. Now, Attorney General Jason Ravisborg reported the incident just a few minutes after it took place from the side of his vehicle at about 10:30 p.m. Sunday night. As of Sunday morning, it was revealed that the victim was a man, not, in fact, a deer. Scientists in Siberia have confirmed the first of its kind discovery of an extinct species, cave bear, which has its soft-celled tissues intact. Reindeer herders recently stumbled upon the remains of a cave bear in the Akoshki Islands in the Arctic, which were extraordinarily well preserved. So well preserved that the soft tissues of the animals are intact, including essentially the entirety of its head. Although the remains of the animal have not yet been timed using radiocarbon dating, it's estimated that they're between 22,000 and 39,500 years old. Scientists from MIT, Harvard, Georgetown University say they found phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus, a chemical which can only be explained, at least right now, by the presence of life. Phosphine is a product of phosphorus and 3 hydrogen atoms in a pyramidic molecular structure. In the more pressurized atmosphere of larger planets such as Jupiter or Saturn, phosphine can form through atmospheric pressure by the atoms simply being joined together. But on Venus, the 3 scientists have said that the pressure or the presence of phosphine in the case is unexplained after exhaustive study of steady-state chemistry and photochemical pathways with no currently known abiotic production routes in Venus' atmosphere, clouds, surface, and subsurface, or from lightning, volcanic, or meteorolithic delivery. Meaning, we have no idea, based on everything we understand about science, why this chemical should be in the atmosphere of Venus. They say that phosphine could originate from unknown photochemistry and geochemistry, or by way of analogy with biological production of phosphine on Earth from the presence of life. The study was soon picked up by the New York Times and other outlets, and it has since stirred up a heated debate. You can find this study by doing a search for phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus. That is fascinating. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There is a story I am like chomping at the bit to get to, dealing with plastic and big oil and gas, and the way oil and gas was able to spin this notion of plastic recycling into incentivizing the public to be perfectly on board with plastic. But at one point, when we were talking about the businesses raising prices during the pandemic, and some people seem shocked by that, and I kind of was trying to make the point, why wouldn't they do that? It is the most rational thing in the world. You have a product that people need. That product gets more popular. What do? You increase the price of the product because the product has gotten more popular. Whether people can afford it and some people not being able to matters less. The issue is profit. People sometimes miss that the goal of a company is not to give you a job, and it's not even necessarily give you a particular product. The goal of that company is to maximize their profit. If they can bring on a person who they can exploit, and they call them a worker, they would do so because they need that in order to expropriate money to the top. When you have companies like this, let's say like Amazon or Walmart or whatever else, and they say, okay, we can offer a new service now of sending these things out in the mail. That service becomes more profitable, so we can bump up our prices. The public may not even entirely notice that the price has necessarily gone up if you do it slowly and gradually enough. So people are shocked that Jeff Bezos increases the prices of his products on Amazon during the course of a pandemic. And I say Jeff Bezos is a good capitalist. He did exactly what you would expect Jeff Bezos to do. Oh man, we don't feel like going to the store. Great, we can call Amazon. And my wife, who's a testament to this, Amazon comes to the house, they drop the bag off, everything is great. They have this in this nice bag, all that stuff is awesome. Of course you're going to pay more for it. Why wouldn't you pay more for it? And Amazon, Jeff Bezos, is going to be on his way to being a trillionaire as a result. The same thing is true for medications. Again, that drug company is there to make a profit. It's a company. The drug is secondary to the fact of them making a profit. That's with any business. The stupid human trick is how they end up with whatever they do. But at the end of the day, that stupid human trick is done for a nickel. Those drug companies have every rational reason in our capitalistic system to increase the cost of those drugs, especially if more people need them and they think that they've gotten that much more popular. Of course they would do that. Now, this is where government, ideally, if it's a government working in the interest of the public itself, comes in and says, don't do that. We don't want you to do that. And the government may even say, we're going to be the only vendor, meaning the only person who you can sell that drug to is us. So if you want to increase the price of that drug, you're going to have to deal with us and lack of business. We don't live in a system like that. We live in a system where Donald Trump will try to make some kind of arrangement where he says, I'm going to get drugs at the price of the other socialist countries. How? He's somehow going to tether the price. But understand what that means. Instead of Medicare regulating the cost of drugs in this country, you have such a warped political ideology where the person doesn't want to come out and say, yes, socialized medicine does better in keeping the cost of drugs down. Doesn't want to do that. Instead, he would make this weird connection to other countries in some kind of tether without making the point that those countries are lower in those drug costs because they have socialized medicine. Shane, I want to get to the story on aluminum, on plastic. And basically, big oil, who plastics are created from, misled the public. Now, how did they mislead the public? They made the public think that there was recycling efforts going away of plastic, meaning, hey, this plastic is being recycled. And so even though this plastic is being created feel confident, feel comfortable in the fact that you can put it in this container and it'll be recycled. Now, the reality of it is that stuff was shipped to China, and the ones that weren't shipped to China was basically put into landfills. The public missed the fact that these are companies and these are businesses, and it is cheaper to make plastic than it is to recycle it. And so there's no impetus. There's nothing there. Even though they might have said, yes, we're recycling this product. Their impetus was there only because they announced it. But in reality, the sticker that they was placing saying this is recyclable and all this other stuff was utter nonsense. At the real terms, it was more cost. It's cheaper to make plastic. Trying to separate it out was expensive. Trying to find a process to, let's say, reform it into other stuff was expensive. And so the cheaper option was just a landfill. But people didn't realize that. And so for year after year after year, starting probably around the same time that Big Oil realized that their product was destroying the world, I think this was in the 80s, where they realized their own scientists came to the conclusion that climate change was going to be a result of what they were doing, and so they buried the result. But they came out with a plan of recycling. And if the public full well believes that the plastic is being recycled, then the public will go along their way with plastic continually being produced, not being recycled. But that's okay because the public believes otherwise. Oh, this is a fascinating story to me. Shane, respond to any of that because I think all of that is root of the same thing. The company and the job was to make profit. It became an issue and a hindrance to making that profit when the public got concerned that there were going to be more plastic in the ocean than fish by like 2030. The plan of this then was we need to make the public think that something is going along the way, that this product is being recycled, or that something is being done to mitigate this very specific issue, even though nothing was being done to mitigate that very specific issue. I would make the point that it is sane and rational from the standpoint of our economic space, missing the fact that we live in a world that goes larger than that. Meaning the economic space is a false reality grafted onto a real reality. And in doing so, they cared more about maintaining the integrity of that false reality than the overwhelming reality itself, even though they knew it was being threatened by what they were doing. Isn't that fascinating? That's our world. That's our world. I'm always enthralled by stuff like this.
Here's what bugs me.
Go for it.
I mean, I'm going to apply the same thing. You're talking about drugs. You're talking about pharmaceutical industry and the price raise. You're talking about Trump. With the executive order by fiat trying to sort of drop prices to be more in line with other nations' prices. I'm going to come back to that. Then you moved into talking about plastics and effectively how for years now, the plastic industry, I mean, yes, there is recycling going on, but for the most part, a lot of this stuff is just getting shipped overseas. A lot of this is just getting shipped over to landfills in China or parts of Africa, right. Other places where it's just going to sit, not getting recycled, affectionately being useless, but it's cheaper to store it there than to process it. This right now is seen as a political problem, and I guess ultimately it is a political problem, but there's a unique lens I think you can apply or put on that might help to see it in a slightly better light, at least in my opinion, which is it's also a technological problem.
Yes.
Plastic sorting is a technological problem. Why it's so expensive is that it's inefficient. You have to clean these things out. You have to have people manually sort it.
Right.
That takes labor. That takes somebody, usually a lot of people in these places sitting there. You can imagine during something like a pandemic, during any kind of a crisis, that's going to get slowed down as an essential service. And just broadly, this idea that, if it's seen as, I'll put it like this, if it is seen as both a jobs program and a public good, then you're sort of, because obviously jobs programs are in themselves kind of a public good in some sense, maybe.
Yes. But they didn't look at it that way. It was all profit. Right. It was all profit, though. Exactly. It was like, this is too expensive.
It is. Well, but ultimately what we need is a technological solution. And frankly, even this, there's this deeper question about who should own the fruits of technology. Yes. And I think that is the most interesting question that we can ask in some sense about this whole in this whole space of capitalism or socialism or whatever. Because if you look at Karl Marx's original critique of capitalism, it was, people, capitalists specifically, through machine power would basically automate away labor.
Exactly.
And it fundamentally changed the human dynamic. That is the root crux there. What you're talking about is who benefits from technology. With the rise of AI, there's this deeper question, which is if the person who's creating the technology isn't a person in the traditional sense, if they're an AI that was created by a person or more likely an organization or a nation state or something, well, who should benefit from what they create? Should they? Probably not. But should the people who own them, are they, there are all these weird questions. Anyway, we don't have enough time for it. I just wanted to bring that stuff up and try to stir the conversation up a little bit. We'll be back in a second, taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We will be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back and we're taking calls. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas. That's my co-host and myself, Shane Stranahan. And yes, it could be you too. You could be joining us anytime you want to. The phone number, if you want to call it, is 202-521-1320. What we should do, Jamarl, is try to create some sort of like fancy high-tech solution with an app or something like this. If we want to, I don't know, degrade ourselves and make a lot of money. And then magically, we create an app. People hit a button on the app. Somehow they're talking with us in the room, in each of our rooms at the same time on the show. Then we sell that app. We make, a buttload
You mean like
of money out of
Skype?
nowhere
You mean like Skype?
And
You mean like Skype?
Oh yeah, no, there might be something. No, I was going off board in a couple of directions. Anyway, no, I'm just going a little bit wild with my humor.
I think the technological thing is a good point.
If you're down with it.
I mean, you hit on that.
Keep that conversation going.
Yeah.
Or take it somewhere else.
No, I want to keep the conversation going because I love the conversation. Because it really does get to the root of it, right? Who owns the technology? Andrew Yang, one of the things I thought, I wasn't a fan of Yang, but I do like the fact that he brought up capitalism and technology and the way that workers are being eliminated out of that process. Yang comes up with the UBI, but the UBI is basically a bribe. It basically says, look, allow the capitalists maintain their wealth and their power, and we'll give you a stipend to kind of make it less bad. Look, the issue is who owns the technology, right? Look, as workers go along, and it's easily conceivable that more and more jobs get automated, and as those jobs get automated, those workers matter less. Their labor is needed less. They're in more and more difficult situations and more straits. And we don't necessarily have a consciousness in our society to accommodate that. I mean, for God's sake, if you're talking about just the automotive industry alone, you have automated cars now that can go from point A to point B. And as that technology, let's say in the next 10 years, all of those people who are driving delivery trucks, taxis, Ubers, they're going to lose their jobs. It is rational for them to lose their jobs because the company at that point says, well, we have a car that can do this. That guy, the car's not going to get blue. It's not going to get in a fight with his girlfriend. It's not going to get sick and throw up in the car. Not going to do any of that. It's going to drive from point A to point B. It's going to do its job. And I am going to love the profit I get from it doing its job. I can even drop costs for the various people who are out there to make them feel better about the fact that all of these people are going to lose their jobs. It's what our system allows. It's what our system, in fact, not just allows, demands. When you go in these convenience stores and you see, 2 or 3 clerks, you're going to have one person in that store where you walk in, you pick out your product, it hits your cell or whatever, charges you, and you walk out. It's going to be automatic. Even now, in your checkout counters, what do you see? More and more computers in those checkout counters where you rub it and you go. The people who are there are going to get less and less over time to the point where you may have one, as opposed to before you might have had 10. This is a natural flow.
Jamarl, we've got 2 calls. Yes. I wanted to check in with you. What's your take? What's your level of worriedness about AI, about artificial intelligence?
My worriedness is not about the AI. It's about how we conform to it. If that makes sense. It's not the AI. The AI is only going to be programmed to do whatever people program it to do. It's how we as a society deal. How do you deal with hundreds of thousands of people losing their jobs in a delivery thing? And do you keep the same society right now where you basically say, well, those people just have to find another job? I hope you understand what I mean. It's the consciousness of your society to reconcile that shift and that change. And if they can't, they're going to be all sorts of chaos. And right now, look at your world. You have 30 million people out of a job, and they're quibbling over a few $100s that people are getting making minimum wage. So, I don't have good feelings about that. And that, I think, becomes to some degree a societal shift that is going to be chaotic, to put it mildly. So, but you're right.
I'm worried about both ends.
You say you're both. Oh, go for it.
Yeah, I'm worried about both sides of that equation. I'm worried about both the AI itself and our response to it. So I'm a little bit more worried about the other side of that too. But we've got Tim calling in from New York. We're taking calls 202-521-1320, so you can call in yourself if you'd like to. But first, let's go to Tim. What's on your mind?
Good morning. It's Nervous Tim again. How you doing? Hey,
good. Great call last time. Thanks for calling back in, Tim.
Yeah, on the subject of plastic, every time I have to toss something out, I feel a degree of shame when I have to throw something out that I know is not going to be biodegradable or anything like that. And I don't think most people do. I think people just kind of like toss stuff out and don't even really think about it. I mean, I feel like, I don't want to become a hoarder because I hate throwing stuff out, but every time I throw something out, I feel a degree of shame. And, I go get a cup of coffee and I see all these plastic stirs. I see people grabbing 7 of them to stir their coffee and tossing them out. Like, it's kind of like, you're probably not saving the world by not throwing out those 7 plastic stirs or whatever. But, it's kind of like, come on, think, I mean, I don't know. You know what I mean?
The thing is, Tim, what
I do.
I know what you mean, Tim. I totally know what you mean. I try to tell my wife when she's recycling, I was like, the issue here is not you and that can, even though I think it's good that you have this kind of seeded foundation of, I want to do what's best. I want to do what's more ideal in regards to a sustainable world. So no, Tim, I feel you on that. But the thing is, they still buy those plastic stirrers. And the companies, all across the United States get those things as opposed to, let's say, like the wooden ones that's more biodegradable. It's like functioning in our world, it is very difficult to
Yeah, I mean, I think about it on levels like, if millions of people, or let's say hundreds of millions of people across the world are doing that on a daily basis, I'm like, this is crazy. There's got to be a better way of doing certain things.
Well, the thing is, Tim, most people around the world are just trying to live. And the plastic stirrer thing matters less.
I'm aware of that, but there's got to be more thought involved.
No. I'm not. Wait. I'm not making that as an indictment, Tim. That's not what I mean by that. That's not an indictment of you of anybody else. We live in a particular world. This is our environment, and this is where we live in. I'm just saying,
I guess one way of looking at this is this has become a political problem. There's been this debate in the United States, in some sense, a meritorious debate between people over this issue when it relates to individual choice and whether the government or corporations or individual people should be responsible for this stuff. I can take a side on that debate, and I will, but for a second, I just want to completely bypass it. If you had a technological solution for this, if you had all trash, not just plastics, but literally all refuse, including feces, et cetera, if you had systems in place to process this stuff, not just the Earth's ecosystem into which we're dumping this stuff to sort of, take whatever toll it's going to take and take however long it's going to take to get processed. If we had our own process for doing this stuff, no matter how hard that would be, it's just a matter of cost. I can't imagine talking to somebody. There might be some edge cases, but if it were free, there are very few people in the world who'd not be like, yeah, snap their fingers, that's done. If it were a penny a year globally, it's same. And my point is, there's a conversation there to be had. There's a sliding scale of value. And if we could just get it done technologically, which is, I don't know how far away that is. I don't know if I'm myopic here, but if we could get that done, it would obviate the whole stupid political conversation. I feel like part of our political conversation is that we are not making enough progress fundamentally on technology. For all the hate that I will give him, Peter Thiel, who connected to white nationalists, I've come on your show before, Jamarl, to diss Peter Thiel. He has one good take that I do agree with, which is, again, billionaire dude, founder of PayPal, dude I disagree with in many contexts, is one take, which is technological progress is slower than we think it is. We focused more on computers than we have on, he says we focused more on bits than we have on atoms. We focused more on computational progress, on creating better apps or whatever than we have on creating any foundationally revolutionary technologies that would actually improve the quality of life for people around the world.
But why?
Whether it's,
but why? Why? I mean,
the only reason he doesn't know.
The reason is very straightforward, because we don't prioritize it. I mean, we're lurching through time without a point, without a goal, without an objective. If it was we're going to the moon and you prioritize we're going to the moon, then in the next 10 years, your scientific progress leaps and bounds because you have a very specific intent that you're trying to do and accomplish. We don't do that. It's all for profit. That's kind of my point about the recycling story. Their issue wasn't that they couldn't come up with the technology to do it. Their issue is they didn't want to spend the money on it. And so between creating...
Well, but why is that?
Because it's, for their standpoint, it has everything to do with profit. If you are going to invest money into a system, it costs.
I can give you another motive.
What's the other motive? I would argue that the motive is profit or lack thereof in those systems.
No, because that doesn't make sense to me, because 60 years ago we were. 60, 70 years ago we were arguably a more capitalistic nation at that point.
We're trying to go to the moon.
You can argue with that, but
we're trying to go to the moon
or whatever.
We were trying to go to the moon.
My point is, we were deep in capitalism at that point. So people can talk about post-capitalism, whatever. If during the peak of capitalism, we were doing a lot more of the technological stuff that I want now, then capitalism surely can't be to blame. There are a bunch of different sides of this, but one thing that I'll point out that Thiel pointed out that it kind of struck a chord with me when I saw it was that, frankly, if you don't think that human beings are good, if your view of human nature has shifted and you've seen people doing terrible things and leaders not taking actions that are going to solve those problems, and you see nations around the world preparing for war using technology primarily for the purposes of greed, self-serving, the self-interest, all that stuff. If that's your experience of it, then you are going to be afraid of technology. And every Hollywood movie about technology is going to be a dystopia, which, by the way, is basically the case. So that's a philosophical side. That's I'm not saying that's all of it, but on the cultural side, there's an element in which our view of human nature, I think, has shaped our views about the prospects of using technology. I think that's going to affect things too. That's not all. We've got another caller. I don't mean.
Wait. Let me respond to that for one moment. One of the reasons that Patrick Stewart went back to Star Trek. I don't know if you've ever heard him talk about this. He said he went, when they asked him about another series, he said he looked back over at the old episodes, and he said, God, man, they were so hopeful in regards to human, like, cosmopolitanism, human expansion, this kind of emancipatory humanism that was there, as opposed to these dystopian dramas that tend to come out currently. And he said he missed that. I mean, it gives people a view. It gives people something to shoot for, to look forward to in a way that they see themselves.
Yeah.
I would point this out, though. If you get people in a situation where their needs are always at risk, the other stuff doesn't matter. Like, the moment that you
100%.
deal with people's needs and you say, all right, these people are no longer in lack. The moment they do that, they say, hey, what about this climate stuff? Why? Because their point of view changes the moment that they're not necessarily dealing with their individual needs. I'm saying it doesn't necessarily have to be this high philosophical thing. It boils down to what is your society? What is your society doing? What is the stress points of that society? And is your society even at a point where it can look up at the stars and wonder? Or is it always just, I gotta get by, I gotta get from point A to point B? I would point out that it's, I gotta get from point A to point B, and the larger questions of reality, the larger questions of our world, get pushed to the side. When you were talking about scientific progress, those were doing wars. You're talking about World War I, World War II. You're talking about the Kennedy thing, pushing for space, which was also part of a Cold War. All of those technological developments were done with the goal of defeating an enemy, an ever-present Soviet menace or Soviet threat that we could always push ourselves forward. When that collapsed, all that stuff went away, and you had capitalists ran the show. It's not so much that I'm saying capitalism is not reason. I'm saying,
wait, no, Jamarl, we could go on for so long with this conversation. I'm finding myself starting to want to push back, but I think we should just go to the caller.
Yes, let's go to the caller. Okay, fair enough. Let's see. We have Dan from New York.
Dan from New York. You're on the line. What's going on, Dan?
Hi. First of all, just on what you're talking about, I don't think capitalism applies to foreign relations. So if we send all our garbage to China and we wipe our hands, I don't think we'll ever. A lot of people wouldn't think about it again, thinking that they'll recycle it or somebody else will recycle it. But I wanted to talk about modern monetary theory real quick, because when I was looking into it, I was watching a lot of YouTube videos, and one of the people who Stephanie Kelton talks to is on the right, on the Republican side, is Warren Mosley, and he was saying that he was talking to some top people in the Bush administration. I think it was Andy Card and George Bush himself. He convinced them that the deficits don't matter, and that really got. So I feel like now there's like half of each party, the Democrats and Republicans, believe in MMT, and half doesn't. And what the half that does believe in it ignores is that there's real inflation that has been happening all along. And just because we don't get it in the numbers doesn't mean that it's not there. or just because they changed the numbers.
Dan, thank you for the call, man. I appreciate it. God, I want to respond to that. Stephanie Colton's awesome. She's been on the show, but we have to take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan. We have with us a great guest, Medea Benjamin, founder or co-founder of human rights group Global Exchange and Peace Group Code Pink. Medea, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
So one of the questions that came up, Donald Trump was, I guess you can say, nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. And the question came up, is Donald Trump the peace president? Now, granted, we're talking about this in the context of the previous presidents, one that started a war that got 1 million people killed, and the other one that piggybacked those wars with additional 7 with failed coup attempts in Syria, with a successful one in Libya to the destruction of those countries, and of course to the horrible situations to which those people were left in, with 500,000 dead in Syria. Donald Trump, whatever we want to say of him, didn't necessarily start a new war. And I suppose that's where this is coming from. What do you think? Is Donald Trump a peace president?
Not at all. He hasn't ended the wars, even though he's talked about it a lot. He's actually put more troops in the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia, where it's a very dangerous move to have U.S. troops in a place where many consider the holiest site for Islam. He has brought us to the brink of war. Remember in January when he killed Soleimani, the general from Iran, and that by pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, he's not only put us on the brink of war with Iran, but he's inflamed all of the conflicts in the Middle East. He has vetoed congressional votes that included Republicans to stop the U.S. from assisting the Saudi bombing of Yemen, which has been totally catastrophic. He has been bragging about arms sales not only to the Saudis, but to the Emirates and to other repressive Gulf countries. He has increased the Pentagon budget. He has brought us into a new Cold War with China.
Medea, just interrupt for one moment. Wait, just interrupt for a moment. Weren't the other presidents also giving weapons to those basically totalitarian states, repressive regimes? And also, Joe Biden himself has said that the military budget would need to be increased, even from where Trump is.
Right. We have 2 war parties. I didn't think that Barack Obama certainly didn't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. Joe Biden is terrible on most of his foreign policy, and they were better on Iran and Cuba, but not very much more than that. So I'm not trying to say that the Democrats would lead us into a peaceful future. Unfortunately, the American people are much more advanced than the 2 major parties are when it comes to war and peace issues. They're the ones who want to get us out of the wars. The polls show that even the majority of Republicans think that the U.S. Continued presence in Afghanistan and Iraq is wrong, which is why Trump, smarter than Biden, says, I'm going to get us out of there. Well, he's had almost 4 years now to do it, and he hasn't done it. Yes,
but the public,
the Democrats are not much better.
But the public intellectually thinks it's wrong. There's a difference, right? I mean, like, for example, if the public, right now, you're going to have people who are going out saying we shouldn't have evictions, and those people are going to throw their bodies on the line for it. They're going to be out fighting cops, etc. Same thing with unemployment or the lack thereof, meaning the unemployment benefits, all of those things are eventually going to create a certain consternation that the people who are out there protesting now will be joined by people with a very specific interest in the issue of class. It digs into them because it bothers them. But it doesn't necessarily seem like that intellectual, yeah, I don't like it, translates into caring that much about the candidate that is actually doing it. Why? And maybe... go for it.
Sorry. I was going to say, in this case, you got neither candidate who's doing it. It's not like Joe Biden is coming out and saying, no, I'm going to be the peace candidate. Bernie Sanders was much better when it came to foreign policy. And a lot of people were very excited about his proposals to cut the Pentagon budget. The majority of people want to cut the Pentagon budget, and yet when it came up in Congress to just cut it by a mere 10%, we couldn't even get a majority of Democrats to go for that. So, people, maybe not for very generous reasons, probably many of them because they don't give a damn about places like Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen, but they don't want to see the U.S. continue to spill our resources, certainly not the trillions of dollars we spent, and not American blood, which is why most of the wars now are not being fought by U.S. troops on the ground, but things like proxy wars, drone warfare, commandos. So yes, American people are not getting out on the streets to say, bring our troops home, but certainly the polls show that that's what they want.
So Medea, quick question. I'm going to thank you for joining us, Shane here. I'm going to cut to the chase. I hear you have some experience with political organizing. With that, I know comes a pretty well-developed perspective on the system and its flaws, and I hope some prospects for fixing it. So with that in mind, we're talking about the absolute failure, the abject failure, one could say, of both the Republicans and the Democrats to represent what the people want in terms of peace. Pretty core issue for me, and I think a lot of people deep down. What do you think it would take, Medea, for us to have a peace-loving president specifically? What do you think it would take for us to make that change?
Well, I want to add into the failure of the presidents and of the major parties, the failure of the peace movement, because we haven't been able to connect these issues of the environment, of Black Lives Matter, of gun control issues in a way that people really, really get it and were willing to do more to force their politicians to say, cut the damn Pentagon budget and give us money for the Green New Deal, cut the Pentagon budget and give us money for Medicare for all. So I think we're doing better in that sense. There are organizations like the Poor People's Campaign that have made the issue of decreasing the Pentagon budget and militarism a major plank in their platform. And we have the Movement for Black Lives that definitely sees this as connected. So I think we have to do more to connect these issues and then to really put politicians on the line. Everybody who voted against a 10% cut in the Pentagon should have heard from their constituents. And we at Code Pink have been trying to do this, but we need more people involved and more groups that have a bigger constituency than we do.
Is there a political solution to this?
Okay, so...
I mean, and think about what I'm asking for the moment. Is there a political solution? Meaning, I understand the political pressure in trying to get the politicians to do X or Y. Fair enough. I get it. But when you have politician A saying, I'm going to do this, politician B saying, I'm going to do this, and that's what you're left with. And neither of those guys is representing any interest at all in the public. Meaning, you've admitted yourself between these two candidates, and let's factor that out. Let's say for the moment that this is just Democrats in general or Republicans in general. You basically get a political instrument that has attuned itself in almost somewhat of a rigged way that doesn't represent American interests and in some degree is representing the interests of something else. Who do you vote for in a context of like that, where neither one of those people represent your interests? That's what I'm getting at. Is there really a political solution to this?
Well, you definitely vote for Biden because on domestic issues, on a number of important domestic issues, he is way better than Trump. And certainly on the foreign policy issues, he is more likely to be pressured, just like he's been pressured on the issues of the environment and healthcare.
Pressured how?
We've actually been having discussions. We've gotten hundreds of organizations to contact his campaign and actually have discussions with his campaign. We can't even get near the Trump people. When we send them the same letters, we get zero response.
I don't doubt, Medea, that they would have conversations with you. I would imagine they would pay a staffer to talk to you all day. What pressure do you have? You are irrelevant to the Joe Biden campaign, every bit as much so as the Trump campaign. I don't understand what leverage or pressure you believe that you guys have for Joe Biden at this moment.
I think that we do. The fact that Biden got on the event last night put on by the Poor People's Campaign means that he feels the pressure of the religious community that's come together to say no to poverty, militarism, and racism. The fact that he has changed his positions on a number of issues because of grassroots pressure. I think we do have much more possibility of influencing. And is there a political solution? You vote Trump out of office. That's the number one thing. And you apply pressure at the same time. We're not saying wait till after the election. We're already applying the pressure, and then we step it up after Biden wins.
Let me ask you this: pressure in what context? Like say I give you the benefit of the doubt. You guys are pressuring Biden, and Biden tells you, Medea, go kick rocks. He does this live on television. He brings you on TV. He talks to you, and at the end of it, he says, yes, you and your organization go kick rocks. What happens after that? Do you still go and push for Biden, and do you still vote for Joe Biden after that?
Well, I'm definitely going to vote for Joe Biden, and I encourage everybody else to vote for Joe Biden because I'm really afraid for this country's future if we have 4 more years of Trump. And then I do a better job as an organizer to connect these issues with more groups and larger groups, and we continue to get our constituents to contact and pressure their members of Congress so that we get bills on Biden's desk like we've gotten bills on Trump's desk, and Biden will not veto them. If we get a bill on Biden's desk that says we don't want no more U.S. participation in the war in Yemen, I'm pretty sure he would not veto that bill, just like Trump did several times.
So, Medea, thank you again for joining us. I'm going to come in here. What do you think it would take to get Americans to sort of change their tune on a wider basis? We talked earlier about the culture of pollution. We were talking about recycling. We had a caller. We were talking about recycling. And the caller is basically saying he didn't think that most people cared about recycling. I think he's probably right. And I think that's just because most people are just living their lives and the sort of sphere of their attention and concerns is only so large. And recycling, while it was a little bit more of a thing back in the 90s, just in terms of the optics, it's become, as far as I can tell, a little bit less of a practical cause, particularly during 20, even though it's an important issue. I'm moving from recycling, which is one sort of small global issue, up to another related, much larger, in my opinion, issue of violence, international war, sort of linchpin in some sense of a lot of the systems of international economic and political oppression that are holding, frankly, our world back. So not comparing them in that sense. But there's also this complacency, widespread and historic complacency, that some people would extend to complicity in the American public, where people see Americans as basically not caring about warfare, our warfare specifically, and our support for warfare internationally, and therefore approving of it, sort of subtly. There have been arguments that I've heard that seem to have been pretty effective on the right, specifically within the sort of libertarian wing, made out of self-interest. From the left, mostly I've heard arguments, referring to people's morals. Basically, this is not a right thing to do. This is not the appropriate thing to do. We're killing people. This is not just. I think both of those arguments have weight, but the problem obviously is we're still doing the wars. We're still in this stuff. So what I want to hear on the other side of this break from you is, where do you think that argument should go? What do you think is missing? What do you think needs to be said again and said louder if we want Americans specifically to stop tacitly supporting, tacitly accepting our wars? We're joined by Medea Benjamin. We'll be back with her in just a second. She's the founder of the human rights activism group Code Pink, and you're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We'll be back with Medea in just a second.
Fault Lines.
This is Radio Sputnik.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines. We divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are joined by Medea Benjamin. She's the co-founder of the human rights group, Global Exchange, and peace group, Code Pink. By the way, before we get back into it with Medea, you can follow her on Twitter at Medea Benjamin. I'll spell that out for you. It's MEDEABENJAMIN, Medea Benjamin. And you can learn more about her organization, Code Pink, at codepink.org. Medea, thank you again for being with us. As I took us out, I was asking you a question. Where do you think we should go if we want to bring American attention? What are the arguments we should make? What perspectives should people sort of what perspectives do you hold? It's not, I think, a matter of trying to force perspective on people. What do you think people aren't seeing that they should be seeing? Medea.
I think people should understand that our biggest problems are issues like the climate crisis, now the pandemic, the lack of decent infrastructure in our country, and that all of this requires money that is now being poured into the Pentagon, and that we could cut our Pentagon budget by half and still have more than our adversaries combined, and would be safer because we wouldn't feel the need to be using all these weapon systems. So I would say cutting the Pentagon has to be something that the American people understand is actually in our interest.
Is it fair to say? Go ahead, Shane.
Medea. Yeah, sorry. No, this is just something I was thinking about earlier. I would normally completely agree with you, but this year has made that argument very weird for me because everything has been thrown into disarray, not just by the coronavirus, but by the massive amounts of money that the government is pumping into it. And more recently, we've had. I know that money is largely gone to the wealthy. We've made that argument many times. But on the other hand of this, we've recently had guests promoting the modern monetary theory, revisit of the high-level perspective that we take on the amount of money currently in the economy. Anyway, from what I can tell, they view things in a very different light. It in a weird way, it has become hard, I think, for the average American to get a sense of what money is, where it comes from, where its value is derived from, and therefore these economic arguments that would have made sense about how we shouldn't spend into the deficit, and there's a sort of pie, an economic pie of a certain size that the military is significantly cutting into, like that stuff feels right to me. That intuitively, in my sort of physical sense, that seems right. The world is only so big. We only have so much we can do. We shouldn't be spending so much on the military. That's a waste. And yet at the same time, this year has seen extravagant spending. And that seems to just uproot those notions. I don't know if that's making sense to you, Medea, but what's your take on that? It's a little bit far afield, but I think it does tie in. I think for a lot of Americans, that argument or that perspective, it's just confusing right now. Does that make sense, Medea?
It does, but every year Congress has a budget, and that budget has to be allocated in different ways.
Right.
And right now we have over 50% of the discretionary funds that go to the military, and that means that there's less in that pie. The fact that they can find money when there's something like this pandemic is very confusing to people, but year after year we still have the same budget discussions. And if you have so much money in that budget that's going to the military, you have less that's going to other things. I think that's one argument. I think there are other good arguments, which is to say, let's look at 20 years of U.S. intervention in the Middle East. Has it helped anything? No, it's made things infinitely worse. So let's understand that U.S. intervention in Venezuela or U.S. intervention in Iran or in Cuba or anywhere else would make things infinitely worse. So if the monetary one doesn't work for you, let's just go with looking at the results of our intervention.
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a weird conversation to have because the monetary one does work for me. I mean, I'm not playing devil's advocate either, but legitimately there's a strong sense that I can hear from people. We've had people talk on the air about how we can create money effectively out of any, and, we can create money to steer industries that we want to create. It just sort of disconnects things weirdly. But that second argument, it's not even arguments, that second perspective that you brought up, completely valid. Our wars that we've waged internationally done tremendous harm pretty much everywhere they've done them, not to mention, not the least of which, at home with long-term wage stagnation, deep economic consequences, et cetera. I completely hold to that. And it's interesting. It's just, of course, there's also the moral side. It's sad that we're so disconnected from the lives that, we're destroying. Anyway, Jamarl.
Many of the wars that we engage in were for profit. It wasn't necessarily for, it's like, yes, we might spend $7 trillion of public coffers, but private enterprise is getting their hands on that oil in some cases, maybe lithium, let's say, for example, maybe in Bolivia, maybe bananas from the standpoint of the United Fruit Company. Like, the wars, oftentimes, even though it might have been a public cost from the standpoint of human beings being devastated and destroyed in those wars, that there were profit to be made by people who didn't have to fight those wars. I think we miss sometimes the dovetail between public interests, or let's say economic interests, and geopolitical interests. Meaning an influence by somebody, let's say like Obama, who would say, geopolitically, Assad needs to leave. He's talking about a leader of another country and saying that person needs to get out of Dodge. That's astonishing. And yet that person would do it. Would there be people who are backing him that says, yes, and we can also get our hands on X or Y once he's out of the office? Yes, of course. So I do think, the cause of these wars, like, it's not always entirely the facade that we give the wars. Like, for example, Gaddafi. When you see the cables going back and forth, where they're basically making the point that we can get our hands on the profitable aspects of that particular country, including gold. Well, yes, from the standpoint of the public, what they would say is, we're getting a strong man out of office. He's horrible. He's going to do X and he's going to do Y. In reality, we were sending guys with thick necks over there to cause all sorts of havoc and then point to the havoc and say, we need to bomb their country after he fights. Like, it's a milieu of things. I don't want us to get it in mind as morally, ethical, any of that stuff, because I don't think that necessarily applies in the calculus that they take. Medea, tell me if I'm wrong in my assessment of this.
Well, there's different interests competing with each other.
Right.
It's so fascinating to see how the U.S. oil companies have really not benefited from the wars in the Middle East. It's been Europeans and Russians and Chinese that have gotten more access to the oil than the U.S. has. The weapons companies certainly make out like bandits from these wars, and you heard Donald Trump himself saying that the generals want to keep in the wars because of the companies that make so much money from it. So, yes, those weapon companies have way too much influence over our policies. And that's why I think it is important to educate the public about how these wars are oftentimes fought for profits, but that the profits are not things that accrue back into the general American society. They're for a very, very limited number of companies, and oftentimes those companies don't even benefit. And then think of what could be made. Look at Iran, a country of 80 million people. It's a very large country. The U.S. companies could be making a lot of money selling airplanes and cars and all kinds of things to Iran if we would just stop attacking them.
And just to interrupt one more time, it's also need to be understood, half of the military budget is basically jobs. Like, half of that, if I'm not mistaken, is basically salaries, people who work in the military that we basically support. We also need to understand that many of the money that goes out from that military budget is done in the various states where there are companies that build products that employ people. So it's not entirely as simplistic as cutting the military budget. I mean, the military is basically a jobs program that we don't necessarily want to say is a jobs program. But we also need to deal with like downstream things where senators or congressmen would have to go and vote against maintaining jobs in those particular states, which again is not necessarily the easiest thing to do.
Yes, and you see how both Obama and Trump have touted their weapon sale overseas as jobs programs, but they're bad jobs programs because you look at the studies like the one done at the University of Massachusetts that says you put $1 billion into the military and you get 11,000 jobs. You put $1 billion into, and then they have a whole bunch of alternatives, and you get way more jobs out of that.
Right.
So if you want jobs, military is not the place to put the money.
It also seems like just tremendously expensive weaponry. So it's not. You're right that the employees, simply the numbers there aren't as many people being hired. If you're going to work in the military industrial complex somewhere for one of these arms companies, manufacturers, design, whatever your level, management, whatever it is, there just aren't as many employees. So on a dollar by dollar investment basis, you don't get the jobs out of it. But you're just buying tremendously and apparently increasingly expensive weapons. And so literally, again, if you look at this purely materially, which you were kind of doing for a second there, and I don't think that's the only or the right view to take, but if you do that, we're getting less the more we put in, which is the wrong kind of investment opportunity by definition. I think what's going on here, and coming back to your point about, again, I'd have to check these numbers myself, but 80 million some odd Iranian citizens, how that market would look to American investors. I think the other side of this is it's not profit in some abstract sense. It's the profit of a specific generation, a specific maybe several generation period of the investor class and of the political class who want stability and who want some assurance that things can go according to their plans or at least their expectations. Two ways of saying the same thing when you have so much power. So with those folks, it's not, again, I wouldn't see it as so much as sort of like almost a cardinal basic ethical thing where it's the pursuit of profit under our system. There are elements there are arguments to be made. But I think, Medea, from what you were saying, it sounds more like it's political. It's our political and military interest. We're just trying to get what we want in terms of them making certain decisions, them being Iran in this case. Is that right?
Well, it's political decisions by a class of people that has a lot of economic clout, and by countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel that have a lot of influence in United States policies. And then you have big lobby groups like AIPAC that have a lot of influence. So
2 minutes.
You get a very skewed kind of weighing in on what policies are good for us. You look at the F-35 and see how incredibly expensive that is. Right. And we started out this conversation talking about Nobel Prize because Trump had brokered a deal between the UAE and Bahrain now and Israel. And we see what's behind that is the sale of F-35. Is that good for the American people? I don't think so. But is it good for the Middle East? It's terrible for the Middle East. But it's profits for a very small, and I'm talking about 5 weapons companies, 5 of them. And they gain enormous profits, and it's all coming from U.S. tax dollars. It's not real business. It's just sucking off the taxpayer teeth.
Sad to say, yeah, sad to say that's happening. And sad to say it's weird because to just carry the phrase for a second, you said sucking off the taxpayer teeth. It's weird that what we're raising is this, it's like this horror. Let me take this metaphor too far. We have raised it up. Government is something that should be subsidiary to the people's interest. And yet what we've grown, what we've created is not just killing people internationally with these protests, but what we've been seeing, it's killing more and more people at home. And we need to stop it. Thank you so much for joining us, Medea.
Thank you for having me on. Nice to be with you.
A great conversation. Appreciate you joining us. For those listening, Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of human rights group, Global Exchange, and peace group, Code Pink. You can follow her on Twitter at Medea Benjamin, MEDEA, and that's just Benjamin. You can spell that for yourself. And you can learn more about her org, Code Pink, that is, at codepink.org. We'll be back in a minute with our last hour and headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
And we're back, coming to you live from across the divided states of America. It is now time for the last hour of the most disruptive show in universal politics, not just American politics, not just global politics, but apparently the politics of the matter of stuff and space itself. In the independent corner, I am your investigative political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, ever vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, laying bricks on that wall, or I don't even know. We've gone over this one so many times, man. We actually need to have an off-show meeting to figure out to tear that wall apart and then rebuild it or something to figure out what it is. On that wall, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There's a tiny bit of a teaser or something there. The reason my mind went to the stuff of space and matter itself, it's confusing, admittedly. It's because our last headline, I'll come back to that, but the last headline in this batch, it's just cool, man. I did a little bit of a write-up, as you saw. I kind of went full bore on that one. Anyway, Venus. We'll be back in touch in just a couple minutes here, Venus. In the news, per the Daily Beast, talking about this first, several immigration advocacy groups filed a complaint on behalf of a whistleblower nurse to the Office of the Inspector General on Monday. They alleged, quote, jarring medical neglect, end quote, and a lack of COVID-19 safety precautions at Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. Among several charges of negligence, the complaint describes reports of high rates of hysterectomies performed on Spanish-speaking immigrant women. The whistleblower, Dawn Wooten, said she believed the woman, who did not speak English well, did not fully understand why the procedure had been performed on them. Wooten told The Intercept the situation in Irwin resembled a, quote, silent pandemic, end quote, referring to other charges of workplace safety violations detailed in the Monday complaint. Upon meeting several women in detention who had received hysterectomies, one unnamed detainee in the complaint likened the experience to an experimental concentration camp, that is in quotes, experimental concentration camp. Wooten also questioned the doctor who works outside the facility. Quote, everybody he sees has a hysterectomy. Just about everybody, Wooten said. Everybody's uterus cannot be that bad, she added, after referring to him as the quote unquote uterus collector. That would be funny if it weren't so grim. And I'm not gonna smile or even laugh, because normally I would, and I'm not gonna. Anyway, that's grim. This should not be happening. If this is going on, which it sounds like it is, that's terrible. More on this coming undoubtedly soon. In our next headline, now 50 days out from the election, Trump is defending his decision to hold an indoor rally in Las Vegas Sunday night in defiance of Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak's orders to keep indoor meetings under 50 people. The manufacturing plant that agreed to host the meeting faced immediate threats of fines from the city of Henderson. Trump told the audience, however, that, quote, if the governor comes after you, which he shouldn't be doing, I'll be with you all the way, end quote. Again, that is Trump going up against Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak on COVID-19, 50 days out now from the election. Meanwhile, on the Gulf Coast in the States, Hurricane Sally has slowed from a Category 2 hurricane, which it was labeled yesterday, to a Category 1 hurricane as it slowly bears down on Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi. The storm surge warning is in effect from the mouth of the Mississippi River to the Okaloosa-Walton County border in Florida. President Trump tweeted out that he and his team are monitoring the, quote, extremely dangerous hurricane, end quote, while advising state residents to be ready and listen to state and local leaders. In our next headline, the White House is today hosting a ceremonial peace agreement between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, normalizing relations with two key Gulf states in the region while kicking the proverbial can down the road on the issue of Palestinian welfare, political representation, or possible political independence. That kicking the can down the road part is, of course, my addition. In a move that's gotten Trump a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, Bahrain and the UAE join Egypt and Jordan in diplomatically recognizing the existence of the state of Israel. Those are the two other nations in the region to recognize Israel. Saudi Arabia, while it has not signed on to the deal, joined Bahrain in allowing flights to and from Israel to use its airspace earlier this September. By the way, we spoke about this earlier at length with Laith Marouf. You can check that interview out at the end of our first hour. So that's about 7:30 Eastern, 4:30 Pacific. In our next headline, around 30% of Americans have pulled money out of their retirement accounts so far, and this comes as evictions by big landlords are rising. According to data compiled by the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, an activist group partly funded by labor, evictions are also up, with institutional landlords, which are defined as those entities holding thousands of properties for rent, giving about 5.5 times more eviction notices than they had just a month ago. That would have been in August, the week starting August 3rd. In this case, I believe it was the week starting September 2nd. In any event, back in August, 165 eviction notices were handed out by this group of institutional landlords. Now, a month later, 900 eviction notices. Again, that's about 5.5 times. This is a small sample size, to use sort of scientific terms. This is, a small group of institutions, as far as I can tell, giving out a relatively small number of evictions on the national scale. But that rate is what we should be paying attention to in large part, not just the absolute or the relative number, but the rate. And that rate is significant, 5.5 times in just a month. We'll see if this gets worse. I'm guessing it will. We'll also see what the government does, if anything, to prevent it. Of course, having said that, I'm pretty sure the government will do stuff. We'll just see, what form that takes. In fact, Trump already has, not to get past myself, but the executive order 104 he signed a while back. The question there is when and how that gets implemented. That, along with two of the other executive orders, faced a bunch of legal scrutiny and still faces it. Anyway, in our next headline, the DOJ confirmed last night that its Inspector General's office has opened an internal investigation into the handling of Roger Stone. This follows the appearance of career prosecutor Aaron Zelinsky before Congress earlier this year in June. He testified then that prosecutors in the DOJ had received, quote, heavy pressure from the highest levels of the Department of Justice, end quote. In our next headline, South Dakota's Attorney General said he thought he hit a deer the other night, but he actually hit a person. This incident happened Saturday evening. Attorney General Jason Ravnsborg reported the incident just a few minutes after it took place from the side of his vehicle at about 10:30 p.m. Saturday night. However, as of Sunday morning, it was revealed that the victim was a man who was dead. I'm guessing on the side of the road. Sad for that guy. But just going to note, I've lived in South Dakota briefly before. Probably be out there pretty soon now. I'm sad for the state. I'm sad that this happened. Jason Ravnsborg never met the dude, was peripherally aware of his existence in politics. I wonder if he knew about it. That's what's on everybody's mind with this sort of a thing. You're guessing if he gets into that position, if he becomes the AG, he hits somebody. He knows what to do at the time to sort of get, exculpate himself is one way of saying it, maybe to prove his innocence or something, or to at least set up the evidential trail to make it seem like he didn't do it. I don't know. I'm not making any accusations here legitimately. It's just what you wonder, Jamarl, you know what I'm saying. Anyway, scientists in Siberia just confirmed a first of its kind discovery of an extinct species of cave bear. This one had its soft cell tissues intact. That's what makes this discovery first of its kind. Reindeer herders recently stumbled upon the remains of a cave bear. These were in the Lyakhovsky Islands off the northern coast of the vast region in Russia known as Siberia. And again, when they found this specimen, it was extraordinarily well preserved. So well preserved, in fact, that the entire head of the animal apparently is effectively completely intact. Soft cell tissues. Basically, that's the bone, everything other than the bones and the cartilage, as far as I can tell. It's the non-hard stuff that normally, doesn't get preserved that well in fossils. And so in this extremely cold environment, actually, here's the thing. I'm going to go into it for a second because we're not in the first batch of headlines. I was interested in this, obviously, because I'm using it as a headline. I looked into this for a second. I couldn't figure out exactly why how this head had managed to be preserved for tens of thousands of years. They're estimating between 22 and 39,000 years. I'm guessing it's just because it was so cold, though. It's that far north. They didn't. It's not like it seems like it wasn't encased in some sort of weird other thing than water. It's not like it was deeply embedded in stone. I don't know how it would do that. Or in resin. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here. I don't know why I'm wondering so deeply about exactly how this bear's head was preserved. But for your morning radio, I'm sure that's a little bit of a grisly image. In our last headline this morning, fulfilling the promise I made at the outset of this hour, scientists from MIT, Harvard, and Georgetown University say they have found phosphine in the atmosphere of Venus. They say this is a chemical which they can only explain right now on Venus by the presence of life. I'll say that again. They found a chemical, and they're saying that the only explanation they currently have for the existence of that chemical on that planet is that Venus has life. Phosphine is the product of one phosphorus and three hydrogen atoms in a pyramidic molecular structure. In the more pressurized atmospheres of larger planets, such as Jupiter or Saturn, phosphine can form through atmospheric pressure by the atoms simply being joined together. But on Venus, the three scientists have said that the presence of phosphine in this case is, quote, unexplained after exhaustive study of steady-state chemistry and photochemical pathways with no currently known abiotic production routes in Venus's atmosphere, clouds, surface, and subsurface, or from lightning, volcanic, or meteoritic delivery, end quote. A lot of words there. Basically, they don't know what caused it, but the only known explanation they have is abiotic life. That doesn't mean they're assuming that's it. They're just saying, that's the only thing we know can cause it. Anyway, they say that the phosphine, quote, could originate from unknown photochemistry or geochemistry, or by analogy with biological production of phosphine on Earth from the presence of life, end quote. Just so you know, we're not crazy. The study was soon picked up by the New York Times and other outlets, major outlets. It has since stirred up a heated debate over whether or not life is actually the cause of this phosphine. You can find the study yourself by doing a quick search for, quote, phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus, end quote. And by the way, as long as we're talking about Blade Runner, not that we were, phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus. Jamarl, have you ever seen Blade Runner, like the original one?
Love Blade Runner, both. Harrison Ford and second
line.
one.
Yeah, you know I've not seen the new Blade Runner. I need to.
The new one is really good.
I'm forgetting the exact line, but like I've seen light glinting off of the shoulder of Orion. You know that line at the end, "Tears in the Rain." It's that famous speech. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I do not. I don't remember this.
It's I'm not going to plot spoil, but there's this famous speech at the end of Blade Runner. People, true sci-fi fans, will know what I'm talking about. Tears of Rain is this famous speech.
Oh,
anyway.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's this like beautiful poetic imagery from deep space that this android at the end of the movie is describing.
I remember that. I do remember that.
Phosphine gas in the cloud decks of Venus. I'm just thinking the cloud decks of Venus. What the heck does that look like? It's, the second planet from the sun. It's not that far away. We can go check those cloud decks out. And of course we already are. I just didn't know they existed. And it's a cool image. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're back into it. All right. We're taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Jamarl, take it away.
Yeah, the phosphine thing is interesting, right? I do think we presume too much sometimes, but the phosphine thing is interesting, especially when they're kind of making the point. I don't know why they're fighting over it, though. We don't have, God's purview of this stuff. And so there could very well be some kind of chemical process that creates that we're just unaware of. I don't know what the fight is over. If it's there, it's there. I guess the secondary question is, how does it get there? And what does it mean that it's there? I guess that's what the fight is basically over. Interesting. But, like they said, there could be some process that we are just entirely unaware of that is contributing to this. In 10 years, after all of the fighting takes place, they're going to like, oh, yeah, this new thing that we didn't know about at the time. So it's hard to know. But look, it's interesting.
That's exactly the thing. Yeah, no, that's just to be clear. That's exactly. I'm trying to be very careful in how I phrase this because I don't want to report it inaccurately. They're not saying they found life. They're saying they found this chemical, and the only explanation they have right now, and that's the key part, is that it was created by life. That life would need to be on Venus. But that's not saying that life is on Venus. Like you're saying, in my opinion, what's far more likely is that they find something else. It's basically photochemistry or geochemistry. It's basically the chemistry of light and geology, the substances that make up the atmosphere and the crust of Venus. So that stuff could be the case too. I don't know. It's exciting though. It's exciting.
Yes, but the weirdest thing to me is that the Pentagon is releasing UFO videos. The Navy is updating their people on protocols for basically giving them information that they may come across. And you have the military right now working with To the Stars Academy, which is an organization set up specifically to study and to build a UFO ship and to study UFOs and to get that information out. And these guys are talking about like molecules. I think the molecule thing is, I think we're beyond that train. If nothing else, at the very least from the standpoint of investigative functions of potential life on other planets. It may very well turn out that it's not there. We're being visited. Now the catch becomes, what does this stuff come out? Right now, there's going to be a congressional study on this stuff, where they're like, what do you know? When did you know it? And what does the public need to also know? The terrifying analysis for me kind of goes along with Marco Rubio, where Marco Rubio said, hey, it's probably better off if it's not us. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. This is taking a weird turn. We're going to take a break. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. We are taking calls, 202-521-1320. I'm going to throw this in, and then I'm going to go straight to calls, if that's okay with you, Jamarl. This is brief, and it's just lingering stuff that came back to mind over the break while I was thinking about it. About the phosphine thing. I know, beating a I'm not going to say what, beating a dead phosphine molecule at this point. Here's the thing. Two quick things here. One, phosphine is produced on Earth only by biology. That's the thing. Is that as far as we know, they actually don't know exactly how it's created, but it's widely speculated, widely assumed that on Earth, this molecule that we found on Venus is only produced by biology, by DNA, basically, by life. Specifically, they're saying that, and this is the second part. Specifically, they're saying that it is found on some that the phosphine is reportedly created by some anaerobic Earth ecosystems. In other words, ecosystems that don't have access to oxygen. This would, in some sense, match what they're expecting to see on Venus. And that's part of why this is interesting, is that there's this layer, this like high pressure layer that lingers around 85 degrees Fahrenheit in this layer of Venus that like plausibly could support life. It's just low oxygen. It's, harsh as you would expect from Venus. But there's this interesting parallel there between the ecosystems that we see phosphine produced in on Earth and what we're seeing on Venus. Anyway, that's just the lingering thing there. I didn't want to get too deep, and that's not too much of a support, but just to kind of fill it in and give people who are interested in checking this out some leads. Before I get too far ahead of myself, we've got callers. We're also taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Michael, calling in from Silver Spring. You're on the line. Michael, what's going on?
Hi. My personal opinion, I have two opinions, please. The first one is regarding the news. In my opinion, every single thing that's in the news is fake. Is not true. It's false. When I listen to the news, now I'm not talking about your stuff, Shane. I mean, I enjoy it so much, but I'm just saying in general. When I listen to the news, it's like there's always some underlying joke. Like it's like entertainment.
Well,
it's like
I'm
comedy.
glad. Michael, I'm glad that you did not include us. I kind of, in some sense, I actually kind of agree with you on a deeper level. But I'm glad that you didn't include us, because technically, if you had, you would have reached a paradox. Because if we're the news, and you're talking on our show, and you're saying that the news is not true, and what you're saying by your own definition would be untrue. It's Zeno's paradox. It's the liar's paradox. Anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just wanted to throw that in there. Michael, you were saying.
Yeah, thanks. I love it, and you too, Jamarl. And I'm glad you're back. My second thing is that we're not living. In my opinion, we're not living in any type of capitalism. Going back to what we were saying. I mean, because in a capitalism, everyone has to have money to spend, and also if you can't express your opinion, or else if you do, then you don't have a place to live because you can't express. Then that's not a capitalism. I mean, best people
man, this is one of those days. Okay, so Michael, thank you for the call. Real quick note, just in general, this is I'm just trying to get my preferences out there, so to speak. I don't know. If capitalism and socialism, these are such abstract terms. I talk about them, But then, like, here's the thing: is if the level of conversation that we're having is one where we have some shared sense of definition, which I think is mostly the case, then it's appropriate to use those terms. But when you start saying stuff that a lot of people are going to disagree with, if you say that under capitalism people should have money, for instance, I know plenty of libertarians, plenty of like very very strong advocates of capitalism who would say, well, no, that's not prerequisite. I don't know what you mean. And then there are going to be a lot of people on the left who are like, wait, what are you talking about? Plenty of people are poor. Plenty of people have no money. Plenty of people are incredibly in debt. I guess my point is the definition of capitalism that you have is probably very different from most people's. Even as somebody who defends capitalism on this show, I'm just going to step in and say that. Anyway, Jamarl, didn't want to cut you off if you wanted to respond. Otherwise, we can go to our next call. What's your take?
No, I think you've answered it. I mean, there are plenty of dirt poor people in capitalism. That's not a prerequisite. I mean, I think what he's getting at is basically you need money in a system in order for people to be able to even buy the products. Meaning, so the moment that you fire all of those workers, let's say from one particular shop, when you move the job abroad, those workers no longer have the ability or cash to pay for the products. But that's not a prerequisite. I mean, that's from a rational way of trying to maintain a system. Yes, if you're FDR and you say I'm saving capitalism, yes. But that's not a prerequisite. That's not necessary at all. The system can crash entirely. Just because people at the top don't necessarily want to fund the people at the bottom. It's not a prerequisite. So yeah, Shane, you're right. That's a lot of words to say. Basically, Shane, you're absolutely right.
No, I don't want to do that. And I just wanted to do the check, see if you had anything to say. I didn't want to put it to you. Anyway, we got Lou calling in from Missouri. We're also still taking calls. 202-521-1320 is the number. Actually, a string of numbers technically, but 202-521-1320. Lou, you're on the line. What's going on?
Good morning, everybody. A few different things. One, the chat has been pretty hilarious with theories about this roving gas on Venus. I think it might, there's some talks of, is it something like a sentient roving cloud of like microbes or something like that? Because that'd be kind of cool. And also, I also want to talk something about the Biden campaign. Medea mentioned earlier about the pressure that's being put on him now. I'm not seeing the results from it because Biden is still saying that he'll veto Medicare for all. He still doesn't have like a truly comprehensive.
Lou, just interrupt for 1 second. I asked her point blank. I said, if Biden invites you, listens to you, and at the end of it tells you to go and kick rocks, would you vote for him? She says yes. And my thing is, okay, if that's true, then where's your pressure? If the guy can tell you, hey, thank you for everything you've told me. Now, I need you to go jump out that window. That is the only way you're getting out. And you jump out, you break a leg. Will you still go vote for him? Yes, I will. I don't know what the pressure is at that point, but fair enough.
You'll pressure them as you crawl back up the steps with a broken leg and and appeal to their sense of empathy that they clearly didn't have when they had you jump out the window, I guess. But the thing that's infuriating me about the Biden campaign is that they've accepted their opponent's framing with regard to the protests and the greater civil unrest and everything like that, instead of accepting their framing and trying to run as this law and order, tough on crime Democrat. They could have easily just pointed to all of the actual evidence that shows that over 90% of these protests are peaceful. And what's really a threat to brick and mortar stores is, the fact that the Senate Republicans seem to be the only ones who won't get on board with signing a worthwhile coronavirus relief bill. I don't understand why that's so hard, but it's not that it's hard. It's that they don't fundamentally believe that, and that's what people.
I hear them doing some of that stuff. I hear them. I hear them doing some of that stuff. What I don't hear them doing, at least not enough of them, or at least not volubly enough, at least not loudly enough, is they're not actually doing anything to make things better for Americans. Frankly, right. I hear them pushing back on what the Republicans doing, sure, and I hear them, talking about doing things occasionally, and I hear some people talking about doing things, but what I don't hear or what I don't see is them actually doing stuff. And so I think, principally going into the election, that's going to be the thing that decides it. I don't think it's going to decide it in Biden's favor because he's not just moribund, but the DNC seems to be too. Everything seems to be going downhill in terms of that party's ability to, get genuine stuff across that's going to get them reelected instead of doing what they're currently doing, which is maintaining the foothold on power that they've had for a little while.
And Shane,
I had a quick question for you too. What would you think about the possibility of our human life originating on Mars? We ruined the planet, and then we had to come to Earth early on and started in the oceans on Earth. That's the last thing that I had.
I mean,
I kind of love and hate that possibility. I'm not saying anything about believing it, but you're talking about the possibility. I love it because on the one hand, that means life can successfully jump planets. Life can hop planets. Life has done that, which that's incredible. But then pessimistically, like we did that, and then we came here and we ruined this thing, and then we came here. What does that mean for us? Where's that going to leave us?
It means we still haven't figured it out yet. So we really shouldn't be trying to create a new life form or anything like that.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I think there's some humility due there too. I mean, I don't know. This is one of those things. We're the thing that's doing the bad stuff in this world, but we're also, like, as far as I know, unless you're religious, unless you're spiritual, unless you have deep beliefs there, we're also the agent that's judging ourselves for doing it. So there's this, if I'm not saying you are, but if we're going to take a sort of nihilistic tack and criticize human beings in a universe where there's no outside force to remedy their bad actions, then at the same time, we are that ethical arbiter. We are the person, we are the party or whatever. We're the consciousness that's judging our consciousness. And so it's just this weird situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense.
Oh, yeah. I think if anything, a higher being would just be totally indifferent and just kind of kick things off and just like, well, you all didn't figure it out? All right.
And that may be what's happened. Some people have speculated.
Thanks for the call, man. We appreciate it.
Well, yeah. Thanks for taking my call.
We also have
thanks for the great call, Lou from Missouri.
Brave and ATL.
Brave.
What's going on, Brave?
Hey, what's going on, guys? Well, the last call actually kind of got it in before me as far as Ms. Benjamin's conversation and her comments about pressuring the Biden campaign and you directly challenging her on it, and then she's kind of. I don't think she got the concept of it. So I guess what I'll say instead is that I just need for those activists that are actually in that space now, I need a little more cynicism. I need a little more aggression out of them because I don't feel like they are able to compete. And if this is a bowl game, I don't think they're coming out with the intensity that's needed to win because the other side is not operating from a place. The other side, meaning the elite, the powers that be in place now, they're not operating from a place of any care or well-meaning for the general public at large. I feel like they are specifically acting to perpetuate their own power and continually enrich the corporatists who they work side by side with. Right?
But Brave, that's a rational action.
No, I know. I accept that.
When the radicals of our society has gotten to the point where they're saying, yeah, I don't care what the other person does, you got to back them. And it's like, and it's put themselves in a headspace where they actually believe, or at the very least is trying to tell people, almost like, we're going to tell you to get under your desk in case of a nuclear disaster because the desk is somehow going to hold you back from the nuclear fire, that they're telling people that we're pressuring. What pressure? I ask you point. And I'm not going to pick on Medea. I'm not going to pick on her. I'm just saying.
I enjoy her call.
There's zero pressure. Like it's like you have no power in this process at all. And
all right.
I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, Shane.
Is this cool?
Upset again.
Here's the model. Here's the model I'm going to apply here, which is, okay, so let's just I'm going to introduce one model and then the second one. This will be quick. First model, we've talked about this a bunch on air. There are two wars going on right now. There is a war within the DNC, sort of by the current generational inhabitants of that party,
right,
to keep their power within the party. And they're fighting against progressives, they're fighting against dissidents or radicals or whatever term you want to use for the various factions, including Greens, including the anti-war movement, a bunch of people who've been around for a long time, and some who are a lot newer. That's one war. And then the other war that's, widely recognized is between the Democrats and the Republicans. And that's the one that we're seeing play out over the next couple of months, at least on the surface. But those wars are, in some sense, it's like the DNC is being fought from within and without. And last time around, it beat out the threat. It got Bernie out. But, it survived. And that means that, in some sense, it won that battle. It's still fighting both wars, however. So that's model one. Model two is, what if Medea and a lot of other people who have been activists for a long time, have been around the block a couple of times, they're experienced, they know that they need to stay in the game, and that staying in the game means working with the DNC. And what they're waiting for, whether they know it or not, and I don't mean to be pedantic or condescending here, but this is just a model. What they're waiting for is a leader or somebody outside of the DNC who has a viable chance. Now, Bernie was that guy, but he's no longer that guy. And there is nobody else right now. They're waiting for somebody else who has a chance to reform the DNC. Now, that could be you. If you're listening to this right now and you're sufficiently capable and, have the willpower, all this stuff, you have the connections, etc., whatever, that could be you. My point is there's an actual opportunity there. But that's my take.
That's infuriating.
We got to go into a break.
Yeah, we got to go into a break. Yeah, we got to go into a break, but that's infuriating. Both of those scenarios are infuriating. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm here with my co-host, Shane Stranahan. So joining us for this half hour, we have Wyatt Reed, Sputnik News analyst and producer for By Any Means Necessary, which is on Sputnik from Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard. Wyatt, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jamarl. Hey, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So,
hey, thanks for joining us.
One of the reports came out recently about basically war planning against Rebellion. Now, I look at this as rational. If I was in the military, I would be doing the exact same thing. I would have all sorts of ideas of what may happen. And any state that has this idea of stick-to-itiveness and trying to maintain its cohesion will probably have similar ideas on how do we deal with this? How do we deal with that? Even if it's not necessarily exact, just some general framing of thinking around the subject. But people latched on to this and kind of, pointed out, whoa, this is the government that's basically accepting for the moment that income inequality and all of these things are driving people to X behavior. Because they understand that it's somewhat it's destabilizing for society to have that much inequality associated with it. And that we, like anybody else, could go through some level of destabilization. But people were weirded out by the notion that the Pentagon was war planning against these guys. Should people be weirded out by that? And should the Pentagon be doing that?
Well, I think you're right to say that, first of all, of course, the Pentagon is planning for what they're calling Zebellion, right? Some kind of bizarre confluence of the youth, these kids who are growing up in a world where basically so much of what was promised is just not materializing or being exposed to be largely fraudulent, right? And so this is something, when we read the specific text of this, describing how Gen Z lived through certain events as part of their childhood, and then including September 11th, and then many found themselves stuck with excessive college debt when they discovered employment options did not meet their expectations. among the least likely to believe there is such a thing as the American dream, that the system is rigged against them. This is describing Generation Z, frequently seeing themselves as agents for social change. They crave fulfillment, excitement, help move the world forward. So, I think these kinds of general descriptions about Generation Z, sure, I find them believable. And then I kind of read down further into what exactly is it that's being described here under this sort of war planning scenario. Well, it describes would-be members of Z-Bellion being given instructions for going to sites on the dark web that allow them to access sophisticated malware to siphon funds from corporations, financial institutions, and nonprofits that support the quote-unquote establishment. The gains would be converted into Bitcoin, distributed to worthy recipients, including fellow Z-Bellion members who claim financial need. Now this, and in this scenario, right, the Z-Bellion leadership assures the members that their Robinhood-esque wealth distribution is not only untraceable by law enforcement, but ultimately justifiable, right? So we envision essentially a decentralized band of lovable bandits sort of going across the world and stealing from these massive corporations, these companies who have been plundering the working class for so long and then forcibly redistributing it. That has a lot of appeal. And I think right now, especially more so than ever, this scenario is plotted up a couple years ago. And even then, they certainly had no way of knowing then that all of these sort of generalized issues that they point to people dealing with, sort of this broader racial consciousness and uprising in terms of income inequality. Obviously they had so many different mini uprisings, if you will, in the run up to 2018. We could point to everything that came out of Ferguson. We could point to Occupy Wall Street. So it's no surprise, I think, that the military is out here planning around these eventualities. But what I think is surprising is the fact that they're really sort of concede within this exercise how powerful of a political movement this could potentially be, right? Especially now as we reach a political moment when the U.S. government is openly admitting that it cannot track certain lightning speed transfers of Bitcoins, and it's offering, freelance hackers nearly $1 million to try to sort of figure out a way to track these transfers, right?
Well, that's just it.
And especially now amid the pandemic.
Well, that's just it. We've had Occupy Wall Street, so the model is already set from the standpoint of a large number of people getting together under this notion of class, and what that looks like when those people start to become immovable and start to become that much more of an overt presence in the society itself. And so it's not necessarily like shocking. I would even say the protests that are taking place now for the cop thing. At this point, cops kill, 1,000 people a year. And it seems that the public has accepted zero tolerance, whether or not the shooting is, let's call it, quote unquote, legit or not. In which case, that only gets worse, especially since we haven't had 1,000 quota yet for the year. So it's not necessarily mind-blowing to look at the public and say, okay, something's going on, and maybe we need to have some plan of scale in regards to how to deal with something like this if it becomes that much more overt. Even if you're looking for just the elections itself. And you may have a large number of people who say, we don't accept the result. Meaning, whether Trump wins on the first night, Trump has said the only way he can ever lose is if there's cheating. You may have 30% of a population saying, yeah, we agree with that. What does that look like? Like, all of those things are easily conceivable coming up. When you look at, what happens when all of these people get evicted by millions? What happens when these 30, 40 million people who don't have a job stop finding ways to be able to pay for themselves, start getting that much more belligerent? for their own way in which the government, for the most part, has abandoned them in and of themselves, meaning all notion of a social contract. So I'm not shocked that the Pentagon would do this. I think the public needs to ask themselves, in a rational society, would the Pentagon have to do this? Meaning, if the Pentagon accepts that part and parcel to the reason that the people are out there angry and protesting, etc., is because of bad ends that they've had in a country where a social contract was not necessarily honored, or let's say was honored to the hilt to the people who are a small percentage of the population, then it seems that the issue here is a political one, not a militaristic one. And yet, the Pentagon has accepted that on some level the political instrument has gotten to the point of being a farce, that it can't even deal with the basic material concerns of the population. So I mean, this was fascinating to me on multiple fronts, but I think that one was the one that leapt out of it just almost implicitly in and of itself, that your political instrument no longer has the ability to deal with the real material concerns of the population. As such, it is stuck with the responsibility of us, the military, to keep the institution in place through brute force. It's an astonishing thing, we read into what it means.
It's a great point, and it really exemplifies why, for example, when people start talking about the fascism of the Trump era, I'm a little bit hesitant sometimes, because to me, fascism isn't something that you just, one day we were all living in normal land, and then we all took a dark turn on accident, and now we're in fascist land.
Exactly right.
No, the system has always been willing to accommodate fascism. When liberalism fails, that's when fascism comes out. Hence the old expression, scratch a liberal and a fascist bleeds. That's how the system historically has evolved when sort of the limits of liberalism show themselves, when the liberals demonstrate that they fail to understand the threat of fascism, let alone how to combat it. That is when we see the fascists really sort of bare their teeth. And so that's, I think, the implicit acknowledgement of these kinds of scenarios is that there, at a certain moment, the facade of free speech, of, having your nice little constitutional rights, all of that goes out the window.
Okay, man, wait, there's so much stuff we could talk about on that specifically, but we're almost out of time. I've got like 2 minutes left with this one. And I kind of want to get into it. Actually, I haven't gotten into any of these kind of political philosophical conversations when you've been on the air. I'd love to do that. But I want to, just with Z-Billion specifically, it is interesting to see everything coming together with this. So it's Bitcoin affecting the financial system, in this war game scenario. It's the redistribution of wealth, obviously also affecting the economic system. It's grassroots networks, anonymous networks, it seems, in a lot of, in their war game, that's a lot of what's changed the political system over the last decade. At least it seems to show the signs of potentially doing so. On a much deeper level, we'll see how it's actually affecting it in terms of who gets elected to Congress, but definitely grassroots mobilizing. The internet's changed things significantly. And then you even see malware coming in, kind of putting me in the mindset of 2016 Russiagate, where all these accusations were being lobbied around. Obviously, those accusations didn't end in 2016. Anyway, it's interesting to see this stuff all coming together here. In our last minute or two, I see this as a sort of 2018 snapshot of what the DOD thinks about America. How do you see this? What's your broad take?
Yeah, it's how they think of America, and it's really their sort of worst case scenario of what would the most realistic threat that could potentially sort of jeopardize not only the military consensus, but sort of the establishment more generally. Something like that scenario they're envisioning would make it so crystal clear where the real dividing lines on society are. They're not between Democrat and Republican parties. They're between the working and the owning class. And something like that would happen, and basically all working people would immediately be on the side of those who show themselves to be helping out other working people. They aren't beholden to corporate interests. They're beholden to this organization in this scenario. But I think it would be a real watershed moment, and there's something to be gleaned from the fact that this is a scenario of which the Pentagon seems so deathly afraid, or at the very least was recently. I'm sure they are their fears at this point have magnified greatly, if anything.
Well, it's also, I mean, this is, we're going to go into a break, but last closing point, it's sort of like if you were to go down, I've never been, but if you were to go to a shooting range or someplace like this, and we had a guest on, Michael Maloof, who was talking about how the Pentagon doesn't just use these war games to plan for specific scenarios. They also sort of use it to freshen their abilities or as practice. So and my point is, there's a quick metaphor. If you go down to a shooting range and you're doing target practice, like it kind of matters what you're shooting at. In other words, I'm going to view you very differently as a person if you have a picture of Gandhi up versus if you're shooting just straight up at a bullseye or whatever. And it's trivial, but in a very real sense, there is a sense in which the Pentagon is legitimately planning for this kind of a thing. By definition, they're doing a war game, so they are planning for it. But even if you're going to view it just as practice, it's disturbing, it's like sickening, it's horrifying, and it's scary, disgusting. So many different pejoratives I could use here. That they're doing that with us, and that they're doing that with this scenario specifically in mind. In any event, we're going to go into a break. We'll be back in just a minute. We're talking with Wyatt Reed. He's a Sputnik news analyst and the producer for By Any Means Necessary, which, by the way, airs on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. That's 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific. We'll be back in a second with Wyatt. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Catch all the breaking global political and economic news as it happens. Sputnik brings an all-star lineup with expert opinion from some of the biggest names in the news today. Noam Chomsky.
Turkey, U.S. ally, their main goal was to attack the Kurds, the one ground force opposing ISIS. And there have been a kind of a funnel for support of ISIS, not officially, but in practice.
Peter Sunday, co-founder of the Pirate Bay.
We don't have any sort of democratic control over the internet. And I think that we're very naive when we think that the internet itself is intrinsically good. It's not. It's just a very neutral technology that is being used for good things, but more and more being used for evil things.
Icelandic Foreign Minister Gunnar Bragi Sveinsson.
Increase activities in the Keflavik airbase, and that has to do with more activities from the Russian Northern Fleet in the ocean around Iceland, and also, of course, these usual flights of the bombers.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
We're the ones that destroyed the government of Libya. We're the ones that, in a pipeline dispute, that helped destroy the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. We're the ones who invaded Iraq.
Former U.S. Secretary of Defense William Perry.
The hostile relationship between the United States and Russia today is dangerous for both countries, not because either country would actually want to start a military conflict, but because there's always a danger of blundering.
Sputnik talks to the brightest minds in politics and current affairs to find out what's really happening. Tune in. Fault Lines.
And we're back, and you're listening to us. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan and Wyatt Reed. At least right now, we are joined by Wyatt, continuing our conversation from the last segment in this one. Wyatt's a Sputnik news analyst and producer for By Any Means Necessary. That show airs on Radio Sputnik every Monday through Friday, excluding federal holidays, of course, from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern. That's from 11 a.m. Pacific to 1 p.m. Or from 11 a.m. Pacific to 1 p.m. Pacific. Oops, thought I got that wrong. Anyway, Wyatt. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for being with us. We're talking in the last segment about Pentagon war games back in 2018. This came out, The Intercept published this a few months ago. Zebellion, if anybody's interested in checking out what we were talking about, just do a quick search for Zebellion Intercept, you'll find it. Anyway, we're changing topics, moving on to talking about Portland and the protests. In this second segment, well, this is where we're going to start the conversation with. I'm sure this will go pretty wide-ranging pretty quickly, but doctors have confirmed 115 head injuries from rubber bullets from crowd control weapons during nationwide protests. Organization identified Austin, Texas, Portland, Oregon, and Los Angeles as the hotspots during the period studied. This was from May 26th to July 27th. So this, at this point, is actually a couple of months out of date in terms of the roundup that they were doing. Wyatt, you were in Portland, and I believe you were the recipient, not of like a head injury, but maybe I'm wrong. What did you? I remember you getting shot. I might be getting the date slightly wrong because you might have been in D.C. at the time. What happened from your perspective, and what do you think about what's been going on more generally? What?
So yes, I was in Portland. I was targeted. I was shot with a tear gas canister in the hands and the knees. They were aiming for my phone. This was something that I originally kind of entertained the concept that they weren't intentionally shooting me, and within a couple hours, it became very clear that they had received some kind of order to target members of the press that night. And I understand if you were confused and maybe thought that, perhaps it happened in D.C. It did. I was also shot in D.C. recently with a rubber bullet while about 10 to 15 feet away, not doing anything other than recording. So yeah, this as this report, the lead investigator of the report points out, it seems systemic. Right? There's no real way to view what is happening here. These repeated over and over instances of agents, federal agents, and local and city police consistently targeting protesters and those in their vicinity who are affiliated or not with supposedly non-lethal munitions in the head. This lead investigator said that it seems like there needs to be a reckoning with the use of force in protests. I 100% agree, and I don't think that Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler's second attempt to sort of ban tear gas is going to be enough. Just my sense from having been on the ground there, how much force was being applied at any given time. The cops are totally out of control. And honestly, just to bring it back to the Zebellion thing, these kind of war games thing, that really seems like it's what's happening. They are kind of using protesters for target practice. They generally are in pretty good spirits about targeting protesters, brutalizing them, in some cases leaving them with serious traumatic brain injuries. This doesn't seem to bother them. But what is also interesting is the apparent execution of Michael Reinold, this man who was accused of shooting a Nazi or white supremacist, and subsequently essentially hunted down, and now increasingly seems executed by marshals without any warning, without any identification of those who shot him as police. This little escalation, if you will, is a terrifying thing as well, that those who are sort of identified, branded as enemy political combatants can essentially be murdered at any moment in time. This, of course, isn't a precedent that Trump himself set, but we have to look back to Barack Obama, whose administration killed 16-year-old Abdul Rahman Anwar al-Awlaki, and whose campaign went on to say that the dead 16-year-old should have had a more responsible father.
Yeah.
So this is sort of a bipartisan willingness now to execute those who are deemed enemy combatants. A constitutional application which was pioneered by the Obama administration abroad, and whose fascism Donald Trump seems to have very little problem applying here at home.
Here's a question, right, Wyatt? Yeah, I agree with everything you just said there, so don't misunderstand me. To play devil's advocate for a moment, when does it get to the point where the state should intervene? Meaning, when let's say you have a protest, and let's say 2% of that protest gets to the point where it starts to burn stuff down, and it starts to put and endanger people in risk. Let's say pulling people out of cars, for example, and so forth. Clearly, the cops are going to have to intervene in something like that. And you may even have something that may be a little sterner than the cops intervening in something like that. Would you agree with that, or would you don't agree with that? I guess I'm trying to get to the point of, at some point, the mechanisms of the state are going to have to go in just to preserve the integrity of the state itself. Where does that point start and where does that point end? And I agree with you that a political solution should have been implemented a long time ago. I agree with you. I think the thing is, at the point where you get to the end of things, the decision space becomes so constrained, it's hard for people to respond in any kind of real, adequate way that people will be satisfied with. Should there be a point where they respond? And what's that point? From your perspective, I mean, you've been out there, you've been shot by these guys.
It really doesn't even, it's, to me, it's less even a question of my personal opinion about what the state should do. It's a scientific question. What the state will do is what it was built to do, right? In this case, the state in the United States exists to protect the status quo, to protect the advantages and the property of the ruling class, and to protect it specifically from those who might get a little bit of a gleam in their eye, might notice these billionaires have made over $1 trillion in just the past few months within the pandemic, while the rest of us have gotten $1,200, if that, and might want to come get for what, in many cases, is rightfully theirs. So, the government, the state has always been intervening to protect those who it is actually creating to protect. And this is why we don't see the governments of DC, for example, able to actually protect their most vulnerable populations, able to do anything about the drive-bys, able to lock up the person responsible for that terrible shooting in Southeast that left nearly 30 people shot. So, the system will hem and haw about protecting people and about the need to protect citizens, but where is it really when it comes to the day-to-day violence that they endure? Their budget gets bigger every year, and it never seems to be enough. So that, to me, suggests that the point isn't actually to protect the most vulnerable citizens or really people in general. The police are there to sort of make sure that the system continues to work as designed, and that's kind of it at the end of the day. So
Wyatt, we only have about 2 minutes left. Thank you for that overview. I'm gonna do something a little bit weird here. I'm gonna try to briefly bring up nuance, dismiss it, and then move on to a last question. Some listeners probably want me to push back in some ways, and I could play devil's advocate, and that would make for a good kind of radio. But I'm gonna go for a different kind of radio. I could disagree with you in different ways, plenty of them. But I don't really care. Frankly, I think the government needs to change. It's just I don't think this is the way to do that. To do that, I don't really care about that. Even though that's a nuance that I don't need to get into. I guess the question that I have for you is, where do you see leadership coming from? This is, I think, what I don't see that you might. Where do you see leadership coming from in terms of this crisis? In terms of when it gets a little bit more violent, but even when it's peaceful. In terms of the protesting, if we're looking at this either reform or potentially, I know some people aren't willing to shy away from violent revolution. I don't see how that goes. I don't see on either side of this how the dialectic of power allows for what I see the protesters wanting. I think that there need to be other avenues. There are other avenues that if we walk down them a little bit, you might make some progress. So real quick, where do you see this going in our last 40 so seconds?
Well, I agree with you that there's existing sort of channels to be able to direct the popular energy in the streets have certainly not been articulated yet, not nearly as well as they need to be in order to have a legitimate sort of revolutionary moment that transfers into real revolutionary organizing and action in a sort of permanent sense. But I think that there are sort of the embryonic developments right now where you see them in every city, groups that are trying out different tactics, developing new things, and then pre-existing groups, many of whom are not even that sort of indispensable to the street movements right now, but which contains this vast wealth of historical revolutionary knowledge that is indispensable as well. There are so many different parts of what eventually will become, something bigger.
Let's get you back on to talk about it. Let's get you back on to talk about it soon. We can talk about some specifics about where you see these things possibly going. We've got to close it out. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Wyatt Reed, Sputnik News analyst and producer for By Any Means Necessary, airing every day Eastern 2 to 4 p.m. on Radio Sputnik. Thanks for listening. We'll be back tomorrow. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Guys, I want to thank all of you for joining us as usual. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another day, and we are done. All right, you may or may not see me later today. I have another, unfortunately, doctor's appointment, just like I did yesterday. But nevertheless, if you don't see me today, you will probably definitely see me tomorrow for longer shows or additional segments. Thank you all for joining us. Like, share, and of course, subscribe. Thanks all.